What would you do if you had lost everything? No home, no family, no hope. What if the only person standing between you and a prison sentence was the very judge you once fought for? Mike Johnson stood in the courtroom, his back slumped, hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the worn-out chair. His clothes, ragged and stained, clung to his skin. It wasn't the kind of attire one would expect in a place like this, an imposing courthouse where justice was dispensed with sharp gavel strikes and unyielding stares. But Mike wasn't the man he used to be. Gone were the days when he wore the crisp uniform of a Marine, standing tall and proud in the face of danger. Gone were the days when he had a family, a future, and a purpose. Now, he was just another statistic. Another homeless vet, struggling to survive on the streets, doing whatever it took to get by. And now, standing before the judge, he was about to be sentenced for a crime he had never imagined committing. The charge? Shoplifting. Not the kind of crime that would normally land someone like him in prison, but desperate times had led to desperate actions. A loaf of bread. Some canned goods. A few packs of ramen. It wasn't stealing for the thrill. It wasn't for profit. It was survival. As the prosecutor droned on about the nature of the crime, about how Mike had been caught taking the items without paying, Mike felt his mind drifting. He wasn't listening to the details. He couldn't. His thoughts were on the moments that led up to this. The cold nights on the streets, the bitter loneliness, the ache in his bones that never seemed to go away. He used to have a family. A wife, Mary, and a daughter, Lily. He had been a proud man then, a soldier who believed in honor, in duty, in protecting those he loved. But after returning home from Iraq, everything changed. The horrors of war, the memories of his fallen comrades, had slowly eaten away at him. He couldn't shake the nightmares, the flashbacks, the feeling that he wasn't quite right anymore. At first, he tried to keep it together. He tried to find a job, to get back on his feet. But the world he came back to didn't understand him. The people around him didn't know how to help, and Mike didn't know how to ask for it. His marriage crumbled, his relationships fell apart, and he found himself on the streets. That's how it had started. Slowly. Like a creeping shadow that overtakes you before you even realize it. One day, you're a man with a purpose, a future. The next, you're nothing. Invisible. Forgotten. Mr. Johnson, the voice of the prosecutor cut through his thoughts, and Mike snapped back to reality. The prosecutor was now addressing the judge, her voice stern. Given the nature of the crime and the defendant's history of prior offenses, we request the maximum sentence. Mike flinched at the word maximum. His stomach twisted. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the thought of prison or the realization that this might be the end of the road for him. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern yet weary expression, glanced down at the file in front of her. Judge Ellen Richards. Mike had never met her before, but he recognized her name. Everyone did. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to the law, her reputation for being tough but fair. A former prosecutor, she'd climbed the ranks to become one of the most respected judges in the district. But today, Mike wasn't a criminal in her eyes. He wasn't just another homeless man who had lost his way. He was a person. A person who, for reasons beyond his control, had found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mr. Johnson, Judge Richard said, her voice measured but firm. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Mike swallowed hard. He wanted to say something. Something that might make her see him as more than just a case. But the words were stuck in his throat. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, judgment in their gaze. He had no defense, no excuse. He had nothing. But then, something strange happened. Judge Richards paused, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the file in front of her. Something was different in her expression now. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. Confusion. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. Mike Johnson. She said slowly, almost to herself. Is that really you? Mike's heart skipped a beat. For the briefest moment, time seemed to slow down. He looked up at her, unsure of what was happening. Did she know him? No, that couldn't be. He was just a nobody. Just a forgotten man. Then, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, but with an unmistakable edge of surprise. You're the Marine who served in Iraq, aren't you? The one who was involved in that case back in 2008. Mike blinked, his mind racing. He couldn't believe it. She remembered him. He remembered her, too. Back then, she had been a young prosecutor, assigned to his case when he had been part of a military operation that had gone terribly wrong. It had been a complex situation, and though Mike had never been charged with anything, the aftermath had haunted him for years. The scars, both physical and emotional, lingered long after the war had ended. Judge Richards had been there, in that courtroom, fighting for the rights of soldiers like him. She had spoken about the psychological toll war took on men like Mike, who returned home broken and scarred. At the time, he had been grateful for her understanding, though he had never imagined seeing her again. But now, here she was. And here he was, a broken man on trial for a petty crime. The courtroom fell silent, and Mike could feel every eye on him. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Judge Richards seemed to gather herself, her expression softening just a little. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was watching the exchange with confusion. I need a moment, the judge said, her voice commanding. Please step out for a recess. As the prosecutor and the others filed out of the courtroom, Mike sat there, his mind spinning. What was happening? What did this all mean? He looked up at Judge Richards, who had risen from her chair and was now standing by her desk, her back to him. She was taking a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of the file in front of her. Then, after a long pause, she turned back to him. Mike, she said softly, her voice now much gentler. I know who you are. I remember you. I don't know what happened to you, but I'm going to make sure you don't get lost in this system. Not on my watch. And with that, everything changed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mike Johnson sat quietly in the holding cell, his hands clasped tightly together, his head resting against the cold concrete wall. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of footsteps echoing from the hallway. His mind was still reeling from what had just transpired in the courtroom. How had Judge Richards recognized him? More importantly, what would she do now? The confusion and disbelief had settled, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. His body ached, not from the hard bench he'd been sitting on, but from the weight of years spent struggling to survive. His clothes were dirty and worn, the remnants of a man who had fallen through the cracks of society. He was just another homeless vet, one of many who were too easily forgotten. But Mike wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, he had been someone different. A man full of pride, ambition, and the unwavering belief that he could conquer whatever challenges came his way. He had a family, a wife, Mary, and a daughter, Lily. He had a purpose. He had a future. It was all supposed to be part of the American dream. Work hard, protect your country, raise a family, and live a life of dignity. But that was before Iraq. Mike had enlisted in the Marines straight out of high school. It wasn't because he had a burning desire to fight in a foreign land or because he had any particular love for the military. No, he had enlisted because it was the only way out of a small town where opportunities were limited. His family didn't have the money for college, and he knew he didn't want to spend his life working at a dead-end job. So, he joined the Marines with the hope of making something of himself. Little did he know that the experiences he would face in the deserts of the Middle East would shape the man he would become in ways he never expected. He was deployed to Iraq in 2005, a time when the war was at its peak. The missions were dangerous, the days long and brutal. Mike had seen things that no one should ever have to witness. He had seen friends fall, their lives extinguished in an instant. He had seen villages torn apart, families displaced, and children who no longer smiled, their innocence lost to the ravages of war. He came home after 2 tours, but the man who returned was a shadow of the one who had left. The horrors he had seen haunted him at night, the faces of his fallen comrades flashing in his dreams, their screams echoing in his ears. He couldn't escape it. The memories were a constant weight on his chest, pushing him further into a darkness he didn't know how to escape. At first, Mike tried to find normalcy. He tried to return to his old life, to be the husband and father he once was. But it wasn't that easy. He found himself withdrawing from his family, unable to connect with Mary, unable to even look at Lily without feeling the crushing weight of guilt. He couldn't understand what was happening to him, why he felt so distant, so broken. Mary tried to help, but she didn't understand either. She had heard about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but she didn't know what it really felt like. She couldn't grasp how someone could go from being a loving father and husband to a man who couldn't even leave the house without feeling like the world was closing in on him. Their marriage began to deteriorate. Mike became angry, irritable, and withdrawn. He stopped talking to Mary. He stopped participating in family activities. The once joyful sounds of their home, Lily's laughter, Mary's voice, faded into the background of a life he couldn't seem to find his way out of. And then, one day, Mary left. She couldn't take it anymore. She told him she needed space, that she couldn't keep living with someone who had become a stranger to her. Mike's heart broke as he watched his family walk out the door, but he couldn't blame her. He had already lost the battle within himself. Without them, he had nothing. The next few months were a blur. Mike found himself sinking deeper into depression, wandering the streets of the city with no destination in mind. He tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a man who had been out of the job market for years, a man with no real skills, a man who looked like he belonged to the streets. He had once been a Marine, a man who stood tall, who could command respect. But now, he was nothing. A shadow, a ghost. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Mike found himself without a home. He slept in shelters, on park benches, wherever he could find some semblance of safety. But safety was a fleeting concept for someone like him. Sometimes, the days blurred together, and Mike couldn't remember the last time he had had a real meal or the last time he had felt truly human. The nights were the worst, cold and lonely, the memories of war swirling in his mind like a storm he couldn't escape. In those moments, Mike would often wonder how he had gotten here. How had the bright young man who had joined the Marines, full of promise and hope, ended up a homeless veteran, struggling to survive? Was it the war? The PTSD? Or had it been the slow unraveling of his life, piece by piece, until nothing was left? As Mike sat in the holding cell, his thoughts turned to those questions once again. He thought about his time in the military, about the comrades he had lost, about the people he used to love. And, for the first time in a long while, he thought about hope. The sudden realization that Judge Richards knew who he was, the same judge who had once fought for soldiers like him, brought a strange sense of clarity. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for him. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. The doors of the holding cell clanged open, and a guard stepped inside. "You're up, Johnson," he said gruffly. Mike stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. As he walked out of the cell, his thoughts swirled again. He didn't know what was going to happen next. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope. Mike walked down the narrow corridor, the heavy clink of his worn shoes echoing off the cold, sterile walls of the courthouse. His thoughts were tangled, his heart still pounding from the unexpected recognition by Judge Richards. Every step felt surreal, like he was in a fog, unsure of where he was headed. He had come to the courthouse expecting to face a routine, if humiliating, sentence. But now, everything had shifted. The guard led him to a small conference room, the stark fluorescent lighting overhead casting a harsh glow on the gray walls. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should he sit? Stand? Wait? His mind had been racing since the moment Judge Richards had stopped the proceedings, the uncertainty of what was about to happen hanging over him like a storm cloud. The door opened, and Judge Richards entered the room. Her expression was thoughtful, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her gaze. She didn't look like a woman who made decisions lightly. And Mike could see that this wasn't just about the crime he had committed anymore, it was about something deeper. Something personal. She motioned for him to sit down. Mike hesitated, but then he lowered himself onto the chair across from her, trying to make himself as small as possible, as if he could disappear entirely from the weight of the situation. "You're probably wondering why I stopped the hearing," Judge Richards began, her voice calm, yet filled with an unmistakable authority. "I recognized you, Mike. We've crossed paths before." Mike's heart skipped. He nodded slowly, though the memories that bubbled up were faint, scattered. It had been years. And he had never imagined that a person from his past would show up in such a pivotal moment. "You probably don't remember me," she continued, "but I remember you. You were part of the operation back in 2008. The one that went wrong." He looked up at her, surprised. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The operation. He had been part of a military mission that had spiraled out of control, leaving a trail of questions and a lot of unanswered pain. Mike wasn't the one who had made the critical decisions, but as always, he had been there. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still very much a part of him. "I remember hearing about that," Judge Richards said softly, almost to herself. "There were a lot of people who didn't understand what you and others went through. I never forgot you." Mike could hardly believe it. Of all the things that had happened in his life, this moment, this conversation, felt like an anchor, a pull towards something he had long forgotten, humanity, compassion, and maybe even a second chance. It was strange, but as he looked at her, he saw something in her eyes, something more than just the professional detachment of a judge. He saw understanding. Maybe even empathy. "Why are you here, Mike?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. "What happened to you?" The question was simple, but it was the kind of question that Mike had never truly answered. Not to anyone, not even to himself. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I came back from Iraq, and everything was different. I didn't know how to be the man I was before. I tried, I really did. But I couldn't. The memories, they don't stop. The things I saw, the things I did. It's like they're stuck with me, and I can't shake them." Judge Richards nodded, her gaze never leaving him. "It's not easy, I know that. But it doesn't have to define you, Mike. What happened today, it's not the end. It's just another step in a long journey. But you can still change the course of that journey." Mike felt a sharp pang in his chest. Could he really change? Could he even remember how to fight for a future after so many years of losing? It felt like a cruel joke, a broken man thinking he could still be fixed. But how? How do you start over when you've lost everything? When your own family doesn't want anything to do with you anymore? His voice cracked, the pain leaking through the cracks in his tough exterior. Judge Richards took a long pause, letting the silence settle between them. "You start by believing that there's still something worth fighting for. You start by facing your past, but not letting it control you. The road ahead is never going to be easy, but you have to decide if you want to keep walking down it." Mike didn't know what to say. Her words were a lifeline, but the weight of them was almost too much to bear. Could he really take control again? Could he fix what had been broken? After a long moment, Judge Richards finally spoke again, her tone softening. "Mike, I'm not going to sentence you today. I think there's more to this than just a petty theft charge. You're not a criminal, Mike. You're a man who's lost his way, and I want to help you find it again." Mike blinked, his breath catching in his throat. "You're not sending me to jail." "No," she said firmly. "I'm not. But you have to prove that you're willing to fight for something better. For yourself." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mike had never felt so torn, so conflicted. He was being given an opportunity that most people would only dream of. But the weight of it, of the expectation, was almost too much to bear. "How do I do that?" Mike finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Richards leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "I'll get you into a rehabilitation program. PTSD therapy, job training, a place to stay. It's not going to be easy, but it's a start. You can't keep running from your past, Mike. But you also don't have to face it alone." Mike sat there, stunned. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside of him. It was a small flicker, but it was there, hope. Judge Richard stood up, her eyes locking with his. "You have a choice. A real one. But you have to make it now. What will it be, Mike? Will you take that first step?" Mike stood up, his legs shaky, his heart still heavy, but a newfound determination rising within him. "I'll take it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take the first step." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mike had been placed in a rehabilitation program, one that was designed specifically for veterans who had struggled with PTSD and homelessness. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, not because the program itself was difficult, but because it forced him to confront everything he had been running from. Every day, he was required to sit in group therapy sessions, to talk about his time in Iraq, to remember the things he had seen and done. At first, it felt like he was being asked to relive his worst nightmares. Every session dredged up memories he had buried deep, memories that threatened to consume him. There were moments when he wanted to run, when he felt like he couldn't take another step, but then he would remember Judge Richard's words, "You don't have to face it alone." Mike wasn't sure what exactly that meant at first, but the more he attended the sessions, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it. In those rooms, he wasn't alone. There were other veterans like him, men and women who had walked through hell and back, each of them struggling with their own ghosts. Some of them were further along in their healing than others, but they all shared one thing, a desire to move forward. The first time Mike spoke in a group session, his voice was barely audible. The words came out in a rush, jagged and raw. "I don't know how to forgive myself. I don't know how to live with what I've done," he had said, his hands trembling. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Mike thought he would be swallowed by the weight of his own guilt. But then someone else spoke up. A man named Frank, a former Army Ranger, put a hand on Mike's shoulder. "You don't have to forgive yourself right away, Mike," he said gently. "It takes time. But talking about it, sharing it with people who understand, it's the first step. You're not alone in this." That was the first time Mike realized that healing wasn't just about moving forward, it was about acknowledging the past, accepting the pain, and slowly letting go of the guilt that had been shackling him for so long. But there were days when it felt impossible. There were mornings when Mike would wake up in his small, bare room, and the weight of the world would settle on his chest. The memories of the war, the faces of his fallen comrades, would flood his mind. He could still hear the crackling of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the endless marching in the desert heat. The images were burned into his mind, relentless and unforgiving. On those days, the thought of stepping out into the world again felt like an insurmountable challenge. Mike couldn't help but wonder, would things ever get better? Then there were the moments of hope. The first time he managed to speak to a therapist without breaking down. The first time he held a job, albeit part-time, sweeping floors at a local restaurant, and felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mike started to believe that maybe there was something he could still offer the world. Maybe he could still make a difference, even if it was just in small ways. But with every step forward came new challenges. The hardest part, Mike soon realized, was the feeling of being an outsider. No one knew him as anything other than a homeless vet. No one knew the man he had been before the war, before the darkness had crept into his soul. And even though he was slowly rebuilding his life, there were days when the isolation felt unbearable. One afternoon, as Mike was leaving the rehabilitation center for the day, he ran into an old acquaintance from his past, a man named Sam, someone he had known briefly before the war. Sam was standing outside a small convenience store, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes widened when he saw Mike. "Mike Johnson?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Mike nodded, unsure of how to respond. Sam had been a familiar face during his brief time back home before enlisting. They weren't close, but they had shared a few beers at the local bar, talked about sports, and joked about life. "You look different," Sam said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "What happened to you, man? You disappeared after the war." Mike looked at him, trying to suppress the anger that rose in his chest. "I came back," he said softly, "but I wasn't the same." Sam looked at him with a mix of curiosity and pity. "Yeah, I can see that. But, hey, it's good to see you're still around. You were one of the good guys, you know. Didn't deserve to fall off the map like you did." Mike forced a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm trying to get back on track. It's not easy." "Yeah, I get that," Sam said, flicking the cigarette butt to the ground and grinding it under his boot. "Well, if you ever need anything, man, I'm around. Just, don't disappear again, alright?" Mike nodded, his chest tightening. He appreciated Sam's words, but the truth was, he felt like he was disappearing every day. The more he tried to heal, the more he felt like a ghost. A man who didn't belong in the world he once knew. But as Sam walked away, Mike felt something shift inside of him. Maybe it was the reminder that people still cared, or maybe it was the realization that he didn't have to face the journey alone. There were still people out there who saw him as someone worth saving, someone worth helping. The rehabilitation program wasn't just about the therapy or the job training, it was about rebuilding connections. It was about finding a way to re-enter the world, piece by piece. And though the road ahead was still long, Mike realized he wasn't as alone as he had once thought. There was still hope. Mike sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the cracked walls of his small room. The rehabilitation center had become his life for the past few months. He had started working a full-time job at the restaurant, the work tiring but satisfying. He had made progress in therapy, though each day seemed like another mountain to climb. Yet despite all of this, the hardest battle of his life wasn't in the group therapy sessions, the rehab program, or the long hours at work. It was within himself. The question that had been haunting him for weeks now loomed larger than ever before: who am I, if not the person I was before the war? He had begun to form connections with the others in the program, started to trust his therapist, and he'd even managed to share some of his darkest memories. But there was still one thing he hadn't been able to confront: the man he used to be. The man who had been a soldier, full of pride and purpose, fighting for something greater than himself. A man who had been loved by his family, admired by his peers. And then he had been broken. The night it all came to a head began like any other. Mike had finished his shift at the restaurant and was walking back to the rehab center when he received a phone call. His heart sank when he saw the name on the screen. It was his mother. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since that fateful night when he had left home to enlist. He didn't think she wanted to speak to him either. He had left without a word, without looking back, and when he came home, things had already fallen apart. The war had changed everything. He had hurt people, and it wasn't just his comrades, it was his family too. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. "Hello." His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in years. "Mike," came the soft voice on the other end, full of cautious hope. "Is it really you?" Mike closed his eyes. Hearing her voice after so long felt like a flood of emotion he wasn't ready for. "Yeah, Mom. It's me." A long silence followed. He could almost feel the weight of the years between them, the unspoken words, the unhealed wounds. Finally, his mother spoke again. "I heard about what you're doing now," she said, her voice trembling. "You're getting help. That's good, Mike. I'm proud of you." Mike swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "It's not easy," he said quietly, his fingers tightening around the phone. "I'm trying, Mom. I really am." His mother's voice softened. "I know you are. But I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I should have understood. I was so angry when you left, and I didn't know how to be there for you when you came back. But I see now, you were just lost. And I didn't know how to help you." Mike felt a lump form in his throat. He had always blamed his mother for their distance, but now, hearing her confession, the anger he had carried for so long began to melt away, replaced by something unfamiliar, regret. His mother had been grieving too. She had lost her son in ways that no one else could understand. "I never wanted to hurt you," Mike whispered, the words feeling heavier than they had ever felt before. "I never wanted to disappear. But I didn't know how to come back." "You don't have to come back all at once, Mike," his mother replied softly. "Just take it one day at a time. I'm here now. And I'll be here, no matter what." Mike let out a shaky breath, the weight of his guilt threatening to pull him under. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of healing in his heart. His mother still loved him. Despite everything, she still cared. As he ended the call, Mike felt something shift deep within him, a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for those who still believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. The next day, he went to therapy, the session already planned. But when he sat down with his therapist, Rachel, something was different. There was a rawness in him, an openness he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I spoke to my mom last night," Mike began, his voice rough. "I've been holding on to so much anger for so long. I didn't know how to forgive her, or even forgive myself. But hearing her say that she was proud of me, I think it's the first time in a long time I felt like I wasn't alone." Rachel looked at him, her eyes full of empathy. "It sounds like you've taken an important step, Mike. But what about you? You've been holding on to that anger for so long. Do you think it's time to start forgiving yourself?" Mike took a long breath. Forgiveness had always seemed impossible, something that belonged to other people, not to someone like him. But in that moment, sitting across from Rachel, he realized something. Maybe it wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about accepting it. "I don't know if I can fully forgive myself," Mike said slowly, "but I think I can try to accept it. Maybe that's enough for now." Rachel smiled gently. "It is enough. One step at a time." Mike left the session that day feeling lighter than he had in years. The battle wasn't over, he knew that. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. The path ahead was still full of challenges, full of moments that might bring him to his knees. But as long as he kept taking those steps, he would keep moving forward. For himself. For his family. For the man he was becoming. The weeks that followed the phone call with his mother were a whirlwind for Mike. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and now emotions that had been locked away for years began to surge through him. He was no longer a prisoner to his past, instead, he felt like he had started the long, difficult journey of reclaiming his life. His days were filled with therapy sessions, work at the restaurant, and meetings with veterans who shared similar struggles. But what struck him most was the slow, steady transformation in his mindset. He no longer saw himself as just a broken man, just a soldier who had lost his way. He saw a man who was fighting, not just for survival, but for a new life, a new purpose. One of the most powerful moments came when he sat down with Frank after a particularly difficult therapy session. Frank, the Army Ranger who had been a steady source of support for Mike, had been his mentor throughout the recovery process. They often talked about their experiences, but this conversation was different. "You know, Mike," Frank said, as they sat outside the rehab center, drinking their coffee, "I've been where you are. Not just in the sense of war, but in the sense of feeling lost. I spent years thinking that I couldn't be anything more than the man I was when I came home. But the truth is, we don't have to be defined by our past. We can rewrite our stories." Mike turned his head to look at Frank. "I don't know how to rewrite mine," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been so lost for so long. I don't even know where to start." Frank smiled, his eyes kind but firm. "Start small. It doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It can be in the little things. Like calling your mom, or holding down a job. Just taking responsibility for who you are today. That's how you start rewriting your story." Mike absorbed Frank's words, letting them settle into his chest. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun the person he had become after the war. Now, for the first time, he understood what Frank was saying. Healing wasn't about becoming someone different, it was about learning to live with the scars, while still moving forward. One day, as he was leaving the restaurant after his shift, Mike saw a familiar face at the door. It was his old friend, Sam, the one he had run into months ago outside the convenience store. Sam had come back to check on him, and this time, there was no casual awkwardness. It wasn't about the past or about their old friendship, it was about the future. "Mike," Sam said with a smile, extending his hand. "You look good, man. You really do." Mike paused for a moment, looking at Sam. The last time they had spoken, Mike had been a shell of the man he had once been. He was still haunted by his past, still gripped by the overwhelming sense of guilt and fear that had controlled his life. But now, looking at Sam, he realized something. He wasn't the same person anymore. He had come a long way from the man who had walked away from everything, too broken to face the world. "Thanks, Sam," Mike replied, his voice steady. "I'm trying." "I can see that," Sam said, his eyes scanning Mike's face. "You know, I heard you're working full-time now. That's a big step, man. And I saw you talking to your mom, too. You really are making a comeback." Mike felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had earned something. The recognition wasn't about accolades or validation from others, it was the feeling of self-worth that came with taking control of his life. "I'm still figuring it out," Mike said, shrugging slightly. "But I'm getting there. It's not perfect, but it's progress. That's all I can ask for." Sam grinned, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for, Mike. Trust me, you're doing better than you think." The conversation shifted to casual things, sports, movies, life, but the underlying sense of connection between the two men was undeniable. It was a friendship that had survived the test of time, and despite all the pain, Mike realized that there were still people in his life who cared. Not because of who he had been, but because of who he was becoming. Back at the rehab center, Mike's progress was noticeable to everyone. He had begun volunteering, offering his time to help fellow veterans who were just beginning their own recovery process. He shared his story with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon of hope. If he could rebuild his life after everything he had gone through, so could they. One afternoon, as Mike was walking through the center's courtyard, he ran into Judge Richards. The judge was standing near the fountain, deep in thought, and Mike couldn't help but approach him. It had been months since their last meeting in the courtroom, and Mike had no idea what to expect. But Judge Richards had become a symbol of support for Mike, and he knew that the judge had played a pivotal role in his journey. "Judge," Mike greeted, nodding respectfully. Judge Richards turned, a warm smile crossing his face. "Mike. Good to see you. How are you doing?" Mike hesitated for a moment, then replied with genuine honesty, "Better. I'm getting there, one day at a time." Judge Richards nodded, clearly pleased with the progress Mike had made. "I'm glad to hear that. You've come a long way from where you were." "I owe a lot to you," Mike admitted, the gratitude in his voice evident. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Judge Richards placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his voice firm but kind. "It was never about believing in you, Mike. It was about giving you the opportunity to believe in yourself. You did all the hard work. I just gave you the space to do it." Mike nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I won't forget that." As they stood there, the sun setting behind them, Mike realized that he wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was creating a future. It was a future that had seemed impossible just months ago, a future where hope existed once more. And though he knew there would still be challenges ahead, he was no longer afraid. The man he had been was no longer his identity. He had found a new horizon, one that was full of possibility, filled with a future he was ready to face, no matter what. The days grew warmer as summer approached, and Mike found himself facing a future that was still uncertain but far more promising than the one he had left behind. The rehab center had become a place of solace, not just a place to heal but a community of people who had been through their own battles and were now walking together towards something better. Mike's relationship with his mother continued to evolve, though it wasn't without its bumps. Their conversations grew longer, more meaningful, and Mike found himself slowly letting go of the anger he had carried for so many years. But there were moments when the old wounds resurfaced, and Mike would retreat into silence. It wasn't easy to forgive, especially when the past seemed to loom over him like a shadow. Still, his mother's voice had become a comfort, a reminder that he was not alone in his struggles. She was there when he needed someone to talk to, and he could feel her sincerity in every word. But it wasn't just his relationship with his mother that was changing. Mike's bond with his fellow veterans had deepened as well. They shared stories, laughed together, and supported each other in ways that Mike had never imagined possible. He realized that their struggles, though different, were rooted in the same pain, the pain of loss, the pain of war, and the pain of trying to find a way back to a life they could no longer recognize. One morning, as Mike was having breakfast at the rehab center, Frank sat down beside him. He looked more serious than usual, which immediately caught Mike's attention. "Hey, Mike, you got a minute?" Frank asked, his voice low but steady. "Of course," Mike replied, his interest piqued. Frank leaned in, his eyes scanning the room before returning to Mike. "I've been talking to some of the guys here, and we think it's time for you to take the next step. You've been doing great with your recovery, but we all agree that you need a bigger challenge now." Mike furrowed his brow, unsure where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" Frank paused for a moment before continuing. "There's a local veteran outreach program. They help vets get back into the workforce, provide job training, and offer mentorship. I think it's the right time for you to get involved. You've made amazing progress, Mike, but I think this could be the step that truly helps you rebuild your life." Mike's heart raced as he processed Frank's words. He had been working at the restaurant, and though it had been a steady job, he knew it wasn't the same as finding a career that he could feel passionate about again. But could he really take on something that required so much of him? "I'm not sure I'm ready for something that big," Mike admitted, his voice unsure. "What if I mess it up? What if I fail again?" Frank shook his head, a small, encouraging smile on his face. "You've already come so far, Mike. You're not the same person you were when you walked in here. This is just another step, and you don't have to do it alone. We've got your back, every step of the way." Mike felt a rush of emotion at Frank's words. The idea of failing again terrified him, but deep down, he knew that staying stagnant wasn't the answer. He had fought to get this far. Maybe now was the time to fight for something more. "I'll give it a shot," Mike said, his voice more confident than he had expected. "I trust you, Frank. Let's see where this leads." The Veteran Outreach Program was a life-changing experience for Mike. It wasn't just about the job training or the skills he learned, it was about finding purpose again. For the first time since returning from the war, Mike felt like he was building something real, something that would last. He worked with other veterans who had faced similar challenges, and together, they helped each other rebuild their lives. There were days when Mike questioned his decision. Days when the old fears crept in, and he wondered if he was truly capable of success. But he kept pushing forward, leaning on the people who believed in him, especially Frank and his fellow veterans, who had become his second family. One of the most meaningful moments came when Mike was assigned to mentor a younger veteran, a man named Jake who had recently returned from his deployment. Jake was struggling with the same demons Mike had faced when he first arrived at the rehab center: guilt, anger, and the overwhelming sense of not knowing how to reintegrate into civilian life. As Mike spent more time with Jake, he realized just how far he had come. He had once been in Jake's shoes, feeling lost and disconnected from everything he had known. But now, he had a purpose. He was not only rebuilding his own life but helping someone else do the same. One afternoon, as they were working together on a project for the outreach program, Jake spoke up. "Mike, I don't know how you do it. I feel like I'm drowning sometimes. Like nothing is ever going to get better." Mike paused, his eyes meeting Jake's. He understood the pain in Jake's voice all too well. "I've been there, Jake," he said softly. "I felt the same way when I first came back. But I want you to know something: there's no quick fix. It's all about taking it one day at a time. Don't expect everything to change overnight, but if you stick with it, you'll start seeing the progress. Trust me. You're not alone in this." Jake nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Thanks, Mike. I think I'm starting to get it. Maybe it's not about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it's just about starting somewhere." Mike smiled, the sense of pride he felt for Jake a testament to how far he had come himself. "Exactly. You've got this." Months passed, and Mike continued to thrive in the Veteran Outreach Program. He secured a full-time position as a mentor, helping other veterans who had just returned home find their way back to normal life. He found joy in his work, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the paycheck or the job title, it was about the difference he was making. But there were still days when Mike struggled with his own feelings of inadequacy. He would occasionally find himself thinking about the past, the soldier he once was, the mistakes he had made, and the guilt he carried. But then he would remind himself of what Frank had said: "You don't have to be defined by your past." Mike had learned that lesson, and every day, he applied it. He didn't need to be the man he had once been. He could be the man he was becoming, the man who was forging a new future, a man who had learned to forgive himself and embrace his second chance. As the summer days stretched on, Mike's life continued to evolve. He was no longer the man who had walked into the rehab center nearly a year ago. His journey, though far from over, had brought him to a place of growth, resilience, and newfound strength. But no one ever told him that redemption was a simple road, nor that the challenges of life would suddenly disappear once you started to rebuild. If anything, they intensified. It was a Monday morning when Mike's life took another unexpected turn. He had just finished his shift at the Veteran Outreach Center and was grabbing a quick coffee at a local diner when his phone rang. It was a call he had been expecting but was still not fully prepared for. The number on the screen was from the local courthouse. Mike's heart skipped a beat. It was Judge Richards. "Mike, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Judge Richards' calm voice came through the line. "No, not at all, Judge. What's going on?" Mike replied, his pulse quickening. The judge hesitated, and Mike could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling on the other end. "I've got a situation here, and I think you might be the right person to help. There's a young vet, came back from deployment recently. He's in a lot of trouble, and he's facing some serious charges. But after looking into his case, I think he deserves a second chance. I know you've been through your own share of challenges, and that's why I'm reaching out." Mike leaned back in his chair, staring out the diner window. His mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning of the call. "Judge, I'm not sure I'm the right person to get involved in someone else's case. I've only just started to find my footing. I don't want to mess things up for this guy." Judge Richard's voice softened, but there was a firmness to it that Mike couldn't ignore. "Mike, you've come a long way. You've shown a lot of people that it's possible to turn things around. This young man needs someone who understands where he's been. You don't have to solve everything for him, but you could be the mentor he needs. I'm asking you to give it a shot." Mike felt a lump form in his throat. The last thing he wanted to do was drag someone else into the chaos of his past. But he also couldn't deny the truth in the judge's words. He had been given a second chance, why shouldn't someone else? Maybe this was the opportunity to truly step into the role he had been preparing for. A role that wasn't just about healing himself but helping others along the way. "I'll do it," Mike finally said, his voice steady. "I'll meet him. I don't know how much help I can be, but I'll try." The judge's tone brightened with approval. "I knew I could count on you, Mike. I'll have someone from the courthouse reach out to you with the details." "Thank you." As the call ended, Mike stared at the phone in his hand. This was it, the challenge he had been waiting for. It was no longer just about finding his own way. Now, it was about guiding someone else who was lost, someone who felt the same way Mike had felt not so long ago. A few days later, Mike met the young vet, a man named Chris, at the courthouse. Chris was in his mid-20s, with a gaunt face that spoke of sleepless nights and unresolved pain. His posture was slumped, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He was nothing like Mike had expected. Instead of a hardened criminal or someone full of anger, Chris seemed utterly defeated. Mike extended his hand, but Chris hesitated, unsure of what to make of him. "You're Mike, right?" Chris asked, his voice rough, as though he hadn't used it much in recent days. "Yeah. I'm Mike," Mike said, offering a reassuring smile. "You don't have to be nervous, man. I'm here to help." Chris slowly shook Mike's hand, his grip weak. "I don't know why I'm here," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I messed up. I don't know if I deserve a second chance." Mike looked Chris in the eyes, searching for any hint of the pain that had led him here. "We've all made mistakes, man. The real question is, what are you gonna do now? You can keep beating yourself up for what happened, or you can take responsibility and start fresh. It's not gonna be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Chris looked down at the ground, his hands trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do it. I don't know if I can make it." Mike felt the old fear stir inside him, fear that he wasn't strong enough to lead someone else out of the darkness. But he squashed it down. He had walked through fire before. He had found his way. Maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else do the same. "You're stronger than you think," Mike said firmly. "You don't have to do this alone. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Over the next several weeks, Mike and Chris met regularly. Mike listened to Chris's story, the pain he carried from the war, and the struggles he faced reintegrating into civilian life. Chris had been a Marine, and his deployment had left scars, both physical and emotional. He was struggling with PTSD, anger, and the overwhelming feeling that he was no longer in control of his life. The more Mike worked with Chris, the more he saw himself in him. The raw pain, the fear of never being able to escape the past, it was all too familiar. But Mike also saw the potential, the strength that Chris hadn't yet realized he possessed. Together, they tackled the tough issues. Mike helped Chris face the shame he carried, the guilt that weighed him down every day. They worked on finding small victories, things that Chris could take pride in. They started with therapy and counseling, then slowly moved on to finding purpose through employment training and volunteer work. But it wasn't always easy. There were setbacks. There were days when Chris felt like giving up, when the pain seemed too much to bear. Mike would remind him of his own journey, of the nights he thought he'd never make it, but how each day he pushed through had brought him closer to the life he was building now. Through it all, Mike found a new strength within himself. Helping Chris wasn't just about saving him, it was about redemption. It was about showing Chris, and himself, that change was possible, that a broken man could rise again. As the weeks passed, Mike began to feel the weight of redemption lifting. He was no longer just walking through life, he was living it. And the more he helped others, the more he healed. But he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. A new chapter, with new challenges, new triumphs, and the promise of a future that was his to create. Mike's days had become busier than ever. His work at the Veteran Outreach Program had grown in responsibility, and he was finally beginning to see the fruits of his labor. He had become a mentor, a leader, and in many ways, a beacon of hope for the veterans who walked through the door seeking a second chance. But with all of the progress Mike had made, there was still one thing he hadn't dealt with, his past. The nightmares had never fully stopped. They were quieter now, whispers in the back of his mind, but they still haunted him, images of explosions, the screams of his comrades, the faces of people he could never save. There were nights when he woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the weight of his past pushing him back into the abyss. It wasn't something he could run from forever. One evening, Mike sat in his apartment, staring at the wall, a pile of unopened letters scattered in front of him. The bright light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows in his room. It had been months since he last spoke to anyone from his old unit, but a single letter caught his eye. It was postmarked from a military hospital, a place he'd never wanted to revisit. His hands trembled as he held the envelope, memories of his time there flooding back. He had been there on a mission. He had been the one in charge. And now, that same hospital was reaching out to him. The letter was short, but it left a mark on Mike's heart. "Mike, we know this is a difficult time for you. We wanted to let you know that one of your old comrades, Josh, is here. He was injured in a recent incident and is recovering. He's asking for you, Mike. He doesn't have anyone else. We thought you should know. Josh." The name struck like a bolt of lightning. Josh had been one of Mike's closest friends during their deployment. They had shared everything, fears, hopes, and the agony of their shared experiences. But that bond had been severed the moment the mission went wrong. The moment Josh had been left behind. Mike closed his eyes, trying to push the flood of emotions away. Josh's face flashed in his mind. The man who had trusted Mike to bring him home, the man who had never returned. Mike had always blamed himself for Josh's injury. He had failed him. How could he face him again? How could he face the man he had failed? Yet, there was something inside him, a flicker of responsibility, that wouldn't allow him to turn away. He couldn't run from this. Not anymore. He had to face the ghosts of his past if he ever wanted to fully move forward. The drive to the military hospital was long and filled with doubt. Mike's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as he fought to keep his mind focused. The weight of the years spent avoiding his past seemed heavier now, pressing down on him with each mile he drove. Every turn felt like an echo of the mistakes he had made, and every mile reminded him of the man he was trying to become. When he arrived, the hospital loomed before him, a sterile, cold building that reminded Mike too much of the hell he had left behind. The nurses at the front desk directed him to the room where Josh was recovering. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what to expect. What would Josh think of him? Would he be angry? Disappointed? Or worse, would he hate him for not being there when it mattered most? Mike stood in the doorway for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was quiet, save for the steady beep of machines monitoring Josh's vitals. The man lying in the bed looked much different from the vibrant, laughing soldier Mike remembered. The war had left its mark on him. Josh's face was pale, his eyes sunken, his body covered in bandages and bruises. When Josh saw Mike, his lips curled into a faint, weary smile. Mike, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that Mike felt in his bones. "I knew you'd come." Mike felt the lump in his throat grow as he stepped closer. He could hardly speak, but he managed to find his voice. I'm sorry, Josh. I should have been there. I should have saved you." Josh's eyes softened, and he shook his head slowly. "You didn't leave me, Mike. It wasn't your fault. It was just the way it happened. We both know that." Tears welled up in Mike's eyes as he fought to hold them back. "But I wasn't there when you needed me. I failed you." "No," Josh's voice was more certain now. "You didn't fail me. You carried the weight of that mission. And we both knew the risks. Don't carry this burden, Mike. We all have our own battles, but this one isn't yours." Mike collapsed into the chair beside Josh's bed, the years of guilt and pain finally breaking free. For so long, he had held on to the idea that he was responsible for Josh's injury, that he had somehow betrayed him. But here, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, he realized that he wasn't alone in his suffering. Josh had carried the same burdens, the same regrets. "I don't know what to say," Mike whispered, his voice shaking. Josh's gaze softened, and he reached out to place a hand on Mike's arm, his grip weak but steady. "You don't need to say anything. Just be here. That's enough. We've both been through hell, Mike. But we're still here. That means something." For the next few hours, Mike sat with Josh, listening to him speak about his own struggles since the mission. It wasn't easy, but the healing had already begun. They talked about their time in the field, about the things they had seen, the things they had lost. Slowly, the weight of the past began to lift, piece by piece. When it was time to leave, Mike stood up and gave Josh one last look. "I'll be back tomorrow. I'll bring you some books, maybe a few movies. Whatever you need." Josh smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mike. But for now, just keep doing what you're doing. You've helped a lot of people already. You're making a difference." Mike nodded, the weight of his past no longer feeling quite so crushing. He knew the road to healing wasn't over, not for him, not for Josh. But it had begun, and for the first time in a long while, Mike felt hopeful about what lay ahead. As Mike left the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The ghosts of his past no longer held him in a vice grip. For the first time, he could see a future beyond the darkness he had lived through. The weight of redemption wasn't a burden anymore, it was a purpose. The days following Mike's visit to Josh were quieter than usual. The weight he had carried for so long, the guilt that had kept him awake at night, had begun to loosen its grip. But even though he felt a sense of relief after reconnecting with Josh, a part of him still felt a nagging emptiness. Maybe it was the years of isolation or the battles with his own demons, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing in his life. It wasn't just about helping others anymore, it was about finding a deeper sense of purpose, something that went beyond the surface. He had spent so many years running from his pain that now, when he was finally starting to face it, he realized he needed more than just redemption. He needed connection. He needed to belong. Mike was lost in his thoughts as he sat on a bench at the local park one late afternoon. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and the changing colors of the trees gave him a sense of peace. The world around him seemed so calm, so normal, yet Mike knew that for him, peace was still an ongoing battle. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps interrupted his reverie. He looked up to see a woman walking toward him. She was in her mid-30s, with short brown hair, a warm smile, and an energy that immediately put Mike at ease. She wore a green jacket with the logo of a non-profit organization on it. "Mind if I sit?" she asked with a friendly tone. Mike looked at her for a moment before nodding. "Sure, go ahead." She sat beside him, pulling a water bottle from her bag and taking a sip. After a brief silence, she turned to Mike. "You're Mike, right? The vet who works at the outreach center?" Mike raised an eyebrow, surprised that someone recognized him. "Yeah, that's me." "You're Clara. I run the local veteran support group." She smiled warmly. "I've heard a lot about you. Your work with the veterans, the way you turned your life around, it's impressive." Mike shifted uncomfortably. Praise was still something he hadn't fully learned to accept. "I'm just doing what I can," he said modestly. "It's not about me." Clara smiled knowingly. "That's the thing, Mike. It never is about the person doing the work. It's about the people who need it. And from what I hear, you've done a lot more than just help people, you've inspired them." Mike felt a mixture of pride and discomfort. He wasn't used to being seen as someone who inspired others. He was still that broken man in his mind, but he had started to understand the impact of his actions. I know how hard it is to get back up after everything falls apart," Mike said quietly. "And I just want to help others not feel so alone." Clara nodded, her gaze softening. "I get that. You know, I've seen a lot of veterans struggle with reintegration. The loss, the trauma, it doesn't just go away. But I think that's why we have to keep showing up, even when we don't feel ready. We need to keep showing up for each other. That's how we heal." Mike looked at her, something about her words resonating deep within him. She wasn't just talking about the work, she was talking about the journey. It was something he had known all along but hadn't truly embraced until now. Healing wasn't a solo mission. It was a collective effort. "How do you do it?" Mike asked, genuinely curious. "How do you stay so positive?" Clara let out a small laugh, a soft, self-deprecating sound. "Oh, I'm not always positive. Believe me. There are days when I want to quit. But the thing is, I've been through my own stuff. I've been through the darkness. And I know that there's always a way out, even if it feels impossible sometimes." Mike turned to face her fully, intrigued. "You've been through your own struggles. What happened?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I was married to a Marine. He came back from Afghanistan with PTSD. It was hard. We tried everything to make it work, but in the end, the trauma was too much. We lost each other. He's still out there, but we're not together anymore. I understand what it's like to feel like you've lost everything. And it's hard to rebuild, but it's possible. Sometimes, you just need someone to believe in you." Mike's heart tightened. Her story mirrored his own in some ways. He had known pain, loss, and regret, and now here was someone who had walked through her own fire and come out stronger. And yet, they were both still searching for something: connection, meaning, purpose. "I think that's what I've been missing," Mike said quietly. "I've been so focused on fixing everyone else, I never stopped to think about what I really needed." Clara smiled gently. "It's easy to do that. We're always trying to fix things, fix people. But sometimes, we need to take a step back and focus on ourselves too. You've come so far, Mike. You deserve to have something more, something meaningful, outside of just helping others." Mike thought about her words, the weight of them sinking in. He had spent so long trying to prove to himself that he could overcome his past, that he could be the one to make a difference. But in doing so, he had neglected to think about what he truly wanted. What he needed. "Thanks," Mike said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I think I needed to hear that." Clara gave him a reassuring nod. We all need a little reminder sometimes. It's easy to get lost in the hustle of helping others, but you can't give from an empty cup. Mike chuckled lightly. Yeah, I guess you're right. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the trees. The park was growing quieter as people began to head home, but Mike felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in a while, he realized he wasn't alone. There were others like him, people who understood the struggle, who had been through the same battles. When the silence between them finally became too long, Mike stood up and stretched. I should get going, he said, offering a smile. But I really appreciate this. You've given me a lot to think about. Clara stood with him, giving him a smile that was full of understanding. Anytime, Mike. You don't have to do this alone, okay? As Mike walked away from the park, the world seemed a little less heavy. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe for the first time, he didn't need to have it all figured out. Maybe the real healing came from showing up. Showing up for himself, for others, and for the connections that could change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's something you've done for yourself lately, and how has it helped you move forward? It had been a few weeks since Mike had met Clara at the park. Her words, simple yet profound, had lingered in his mind. He'd spent most of his life trying to fix things for others, to prove he was worthy of redemption. But something about the way Clara had spoken about her own battles, the way she had acknowledged that healing wasn't just about helping others but also about helping yourself, had changed something in him. He realized now that his journey wasn't only about helping others find their way, it was about finding his own. Since that day, Mike had made a conscious effort to slow down. He stopped overloading himself with extra work at the outreach program. He took walks. He started attending more support group meetings, not just as a mentor but as someone who needed support too. He even took up an old hobby, painting. It was something he used to do when he was younger, before the military and before the weight of the world had crushed his spirit. But despite the small changes he was making in his own life, there was still something gnawing at him. It wasn't enough. He had to do more. He wanted to do something bigger, something that would truly make a difference. One evening, as Mike was sitting at his kitchen table working on his latest painting, a sunset over the ocean, a peaceful, calming image, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. For a moment, he hesitated, but then picked up. Hello. Mike, it's Clara. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, she said, her voice upbeat but with an undercurrent of urgency. No, not at all. What's up? Mike said, sitting up straighter, sensing the change in her tone. I've been talking to a few people at the outreach center, and there's an opportunity coming up. Something big. But it's going to take all of us. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to help. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Clara to reach out like this. What's going on? He asked, leaning forward now, curiosity piqued. It's a new initiative. We've been given a chance to work with a few local government programs and businesses to help veterans transition into jobs and housing. But there's a catch. We need to create an event, something that will get the community involved and raise awareness for our cause. I think this could be huge, Mike. It's everything we've been working toward. Mike felt a spark of excitement and nerves surge through him at the same time. This was exactly what he had been waiting for, something that could change everything. But there was a lingering doubt in the back of his mind. I don't know, Clara. I've been so focused on helping others, I haven't really thought about stepping up for something like this. I get it, Clara said. But this could be your chance to take everything we've been doing to the next level. Think about it, this is your opportunity to lead, to make a real impact, not just on the veterans but on the community as a whole. Mike sat in silence for a moment, processing everything Clara had just said. This was what he had been building toward, wasn't it? This was the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about fixing himself or helping others. It was about creating change, real change, on a larger scale. "I'm in," Mike said, his voice steady with determination. "Tell me what I need to do." Clara's voice was full of relief and excitement. "Great. I knew you'd be on board. We'll meet tomorrow to go over the details. We'll need to recruit volunteers, get the word out to local businesses, and make sure we have the resources we need to put on a successful event. This is going to be big, Mike. I really believe it's going to change lives." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and endless phone calls. Mike threw himself into the work, no longer shying away from the challenge. He knew that this was his chance to prove to himself, and to others, that he was capable of leading, of being the change he had longed for. With Clara by his side, the team came together quickly. They connected with local businesses, secured a venue for the event, and worked tirelessly to build a program that would offer job training, resume workshops, and housing assistance for veterans in need. The goal wasn't just to provide resources, it was to show the community that veterans weren't just a statistic, but individuals who had given their all and deserved a future. As the event began to take shape, Mike found himself growing more and more excited. The sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long was finally returning. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly on the path to something bigger than himself. The day of the event arrived faster than Mike expected. The venue was bustling with energy, filled with veterans, volunteers, local business owners, and community leaders. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew that this event wasn't just a one-time gathering, it was a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together for a common cause. Mike stood near the entrance, welcoming people as they arrived. He was nervous, but there was also a calmness to him. He knew he had done everything he could to prepare, and now it was time to let the event speak for itself. Clara walked over to him, a wide smile on her face. "This is it, Mike. We're really doing it." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could see the excitement on the faces of the veterans as they walked in, eager to connect with others who understood their struggles. He saw the volunteers, many of whom were veterans themselves, eager to offer support. And he saw the local business owners, excited about the opportunity to give back to the community. "This is more than just an event, Clara," Mike said, his voice full of conviction. "This is the beginning of something bigger. We're showing people what it means to be there for each other." Clara smiled, her eyes sparkling. "You're right, Mike. And this is just the start." The event was a resounding success. The workshops were full, the job fairs were packed, and the veterans who attended walked away with new hope and new connections. The sense of community that Mike had worked so hard to build was finally becoming a reality. As the day drew to a close, Mike found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, watching as people laughed, talked, and exchanged stories. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. He had faced his past, stepped into the unknown, and risen above the struggles that had once seemed insurmountable. And now, as he watched the success of the event unfold, he knew that he had not only changed his own life but had helped change the lives of others as well. The weeks following the success of the Veterans Outreach event were nothing short of transformative. The community had rallied in ways Mike hadn't even imagined. Businesses that had once been skeptical about getting involved now offered long-term partnerships. The veterans who had walked through the door with doubts about their futures were leaving with opportunities and hope. But even amidst all the success, Mike still felt like he hadn't truly faced his biggest challenge. He had organized the event. He had connected with people. He had helped others find the support they needed. And yet, a part of him still wondered if there was more. As the days went by, Mike continued to work at the outreach center, but something inside him began to shift. He wasn't just helping people anymore. He was witnessing firsthand the power of the ripple effect. Every time someone shared their story, it echoed within him. Every time a veteran came back with a success story, a job secured, a new home, a relationship mended, he felt the weight of his own past lighten, just a little more. And then, it happened. Mike had just finished a meeting with a group of veterans when his phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen and saw the name of an old acquaintance, Judge Danvers. Mike's heart skipped a beat. The judge who had sentenced him all those years ago. The man whose words had cut through him like a blade, locking him into the system of guilt and punishment for so many years. He hadn't heard from Judge Danvers in over a decade. Why was he calling now? He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. He picked up the phone. "Mike," the judge's voice came through, surprisingly warm and familiar. "It's Danvers." "Judge, what's going on?" Mike said, his voice betraying the curiosity, and the unease, he felt. "I know it's been a long time," Danvers began, "but I've been hearing some things. About you, about the work you're doing with veterans. And I have to say, I'm impressed. What you're doing out there, it's more than just a second chance, Mike. You're giving people hope. You're changing lives." Mike could hardly believe what he was hearing. The same man who had sent him down a path of despair was now acknowledging the change he had made. He didn't know whether to feel angry, surprised, or even grateful. "Thank you," Mike said, though the words felt strange. "I'm just trying to make up for what I did, Judge." Danvers paused before speaking again, his tone softer. "That's the thing, Mike. I think it's time we start rethinking what redemption really looks like. You've done a lot of good, but I think you still have more to give. I've been thinking about what you've been doing with the veterans, and I think it's something that could be expanded. There's a need for this kind of work, not just here but across the state. I've seen enough programs to know what works and what doesn't. And I think you're the kind of person who can take it further." Mike was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just praise, it was an opportunity. "I'm listening," Mike finally said, his voice steady. Danvers continued. "There's a new state initiative coming up. They want to implement more comprehensive programs for veterans, not just to help them get by, but to truly reintegrate them into society. They want people like you to lead it. I can help connect you with the right people. But, Mike, you need to step up. You've got the heart for it. You've got the experience. It's time for you to lead on a larger scale." Mike's mind was racing. This was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed of, one that could change the trajectory of his life, and the lives of countless others. But could he really step up to that challenge? Could he take what he had built in the local community and expand it to something bigger? Could he trust himself to lead an entire state initiative? "I'll think about it," Mike said, though part of him knew he couldn't ignore this chance. Danvers gave a short laugh. "Don't think too long. The offer will be on the table for only so long. I'll be in touch, Mike. This could be the next big step in your journey." The conversation ended, and Mike sat back in his chair, feeling a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Judge Danvers, of all people, was offering him a chance to create a lasting change, something that could potentially shape the future for so many more veterans. The next few days were filled with a whirlwind of thoughts, questions, and possibilities. Mike knew he couldn't make this decision lightly. Taking on a state initiative was no small feat. It would mean more responsibility, more pressure, and perhaps even more sacrifice. But the idea of helping more veterans, of expanding the work he had started, was too compelling to ignore. He called Clara. "I need to talk to you," Mike said when she picked up the phone. "Can you meet me at the center?" When Clara arrived, Mike filled her in on his conversation with Judge Danvers. Her face was full of both concern and excitement as she listened intently. "Mike, this is huge," Clara said, pacing back and forth. "I mean, this could change everything for so many people. But are you ready for something like that?" Mike took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the floor as he processed her words. He had always been a man who acted based on what he felt was right, but this was a monumental decision. He was torn between his desire to help more people and the fear of spreading himself too thin. I don't know if I'm ready, Mike admitted, looking up at Clara. I mean, what if I fail? What if I can't handle the pressure? What if I can't help everyone like I thought I could? Clara stopped pacing and placed a hand on his shoulder. Mike, you've already done the hard part. You've shown that you can make a difference in the lives of individuals. This could be your chance to build something that lasts. You've got the heart for it. And, more importantly, you have the experience. You've been there. You know what it's like to struggle, to feel lost, and to find your way again. If there's anyone who can lead this, it's you. Mike looked at Clara, her words resonating deep within him. He wasn't just helping others find their way anymore. He was creating a path for himself, one where he could lead others out of their own darkness. I think you're right, he said slowly, standing up. It's time to step up. It's time to make this bigger. I'm going to do it. Clara smiled, her eyes filled with pride. I knew you would. And so, Mike took the leap. He accepted the offer to lead the state initiative, and from that moment on, everything began to change. The ripple effect that had started with a simple outreach event was now spreading further than he had ever imagined. With Clara by his side, Mike began to build the foundation for a larger network of support for veterans, and the impact was felt across the state. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But Mike had learned over the years that growth never comes without struggle. And every time he faced a challenge, he reminded himself that the work was bigger than him. It was about creating a future where veterans didn't just survive, but thrived. Mike had once thought his purpose was to make up for his past. Now, he understood that his purpose was to create something that would outlive him, to build a legacy of hope, support, and healing for generations of veterans to come. As Mike dove headfirst into the state initiative, it didn't take long for him to realize that leadership on a grand scale was far more complicated than he had anticipated. What had begun as a dream to help others was now a high-stakes mission that demanded every ounce of energy, strategy, and resolve he had. The initial enthusiasm had been infectious. Meetings with local organizations, business leaders, and fellow veterans seemed to go smoothly, and at first, everything appeared to be falling into place. Mike was invited to speak at conferences, granted access to government resources, and was even featured in several local news stories. The positive feedback was overwhelming, but as the project grew, so did the pressure. The first major setback came when one of the key funding partners unexpectedly pulled out of the initiative. Mike had been counting on that financial backing to help sustain the program, but just a few weeks before the first major event launch, the deal fell through. The news hit like a punch to the gut. Mike sat in his office, staring at the email with disbelief. He had been so confident, so sure that the support would keep coming. But now, without that funding, everything he had worked for felt like it could come crashing down. He immediately called Clara. Clara, we've got a serious problem, Mike said, barely holding back his frustration. They just pulled out. We don't have the resources to move forward with the event, let alone sustain the initiative long term. Clara, always the pragmatic one, didn't miss a beat. Okay. This sucks, Mike. But we can't throw in the towel just yet. We've built too much momentum already. Let's sit down and figure out what we can do. As always, Clara's calmness helped ground Mike. He knew she was right, they couldn't afford to give up now. But that didn't make the challenge any less daunting. The next few days were filled with tense meetings and frantic phone calls. Mike and Clara met with local businesses, government officials, and potential donors. Mike found himself making pitch after pitch, trying to convince people to invest in a cause he believed in with all his heart. At the same time, he was dealing with angry emails, frustrated veterans, and the looming uncertainty of the future. But just when it seemed like they might be at a breaking point, an unexpected ally emerged. It was Judge Danvers. The judge had been keeping tabs on Mike's progress and, after hearing about the setback, reached out with a proposition. I know this is a tough spot, Mike, Danvers said when they spoke on the phone. But I've got a few contacts who might be able to help. It's not a guarantee, but I think we might have a shot at securing alternative funding. Danvers wasn't the only one who came through. Over the following weeks, support started to pour in from all directions. Several local businesses, inspired by the community's collective efforts, stepped up to sponsor the program. Veterans who had benefited from the initiative offered testimonials that moved people to donate. The media, who had been covering the progress of the initiative, continued to amplify the message, which in turn attracted more partners willing to invest in the project. Despite the difficulties, Mike felt a renewed sense of determination. The team had been tested, but they were emerging stronger. However, just as the initiative was getting back on track, another storm cloud appeared. This time, it was a political one. A change in local government leadership meant that the initiative's funding and resources were now under review. The new administration questioned the efficacy of the program and whether it was worth continuing. In meetings with city officials, Mike felt like he was back to square one, begging for recognition of the work he had already done. As Mike walked out of one such meeting, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The pressure to succeed, the scrutiny from those in power, it was all starting to take its toll. He called Clara on the way home, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't do this anymore, Clara," Mike admitted, his words heavy. "I'm giving it everything I've got, and it feels like it's never enough. Every step forward feels like it's followed by 2 steps back." Clara's voice was steady on the other end. "I get it, Mike. I do. But this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. You've already made a huge difference. You've already brought hope to so many. Do you think they're going to let it go down without a fight?" Mike exhaled sharply. He didn't know if he could keep fighting the fight, not when it felt like the world was conspiring against him. But Clara was right, he couldn't quit now. He'd come too far. He'd watched too many lives change to back down when things got tough. He knew this struggle was part of the journey, even if it didn't feel like it in the moment. "I'm not giving up," Mike said, determination flooding back into his voice. "I'll keep fighting. For the veterans. For the people who need this. But I can't do it alone. We need a real plan to fight back. I'm going to need your help more than ever." Clara was quiet for a moment before replying, "Of course, Mike. You know I'm with you every step of the way." The weeks that followed tested Mike in ways he never expected. The political pushback grew more intense, and his patience was worn thin. But instead of retreating, Mike leaned into the fight. He and Clara crafted an airtight proposal, gathering testimonies from veterans who had been helped by the program. They sought out influential supporters, from local activists to high-ranking military officers who had witnessed the transformation of the initiative firsthand. With a sense of urgency, Mike took the proposal to the local council meeting. He spoke with passion, telling the council members about the program's success, about the lives that had been changed, and about the veterans who now had hope for the future. His speech was raw, unfiltered, and heart-wrenching. "Don't turn your backs on the people who fought for this country," Mike said. "We owe it to them to ensure they get the support they need to reintegrate into society. If we don't act now, we're not just abandoning veterans. We're abandoning our duty as a community." There was silence in the room as Mike finished speaking. Then, one by one, council members began to voice their support. The momentum shifted. After hours of tense debate, the council voted to continue funding the initiative. It wasn't a done deal yet, but it was a victory, a small one, but a victory nonetheless. Mike knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges. The battle for the veterans program was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. Not because the fight was over, but because he had learned something important. Sometimes, the storm had to rage before the calm could come. He had faced his doubts, his fears, and the overwhelming pressure to give up. And now, with the support of those who believed in him, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The decision by the local council to continue funding the Veterans Initiative was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the journey. In many ways, it felt like a breath before the next wave of challenges hit. Mike had won a small but significant victory, but as the state initiative grew, so did the pressure. What had begun as a personal mission to give veterans a second chance was evolving into something much bigger, and that brought with it an entirely new set of obstacles. A few weeks after the council meeting, Mike was once again sitting at his desk, reviewing the next steps for the Veterans Program. It had been a roller coaster of emotions, triumph, disappointment, and uncertainty, but through it all, one thing remained constant: the need for tangible results. The veterans didn't need speeches, they needed action. Just then, his phone rang, and Mike glanced down to see a familiar number. It was Judge Danvers. "Mike," the judge's voice sounded grave on the other end. "I need to speak with you. It's about your program." Mike felt a sudden knot in his stomach. It was never good when the judge called out of the blue. He had helped Mike a great deal, but this felt different. "What's going on, Judge?" Mike asked. "I've been getting some troubling reports," Danvers said. "There are allegations that the Veterans Initiative is mismanaging funds and not using them for the intended purposes. I don't know if there's any truth to it, but I have to tell you, these are serious accusations. I think you need to look into it." Mike froze, his mind spinning. The program had been running smoothly from his perspective. They were working with reputable organizations, and the veterans had been coming in droves to seek help. Yet here it was, the one thing he had feared most. A threat to the very foundation of the program. "Do you have any details, Judge?" Mike asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's making these accusations?" "Anonymous sources," Danvers replied. "But the claims are enough to get the authorities involved. This could hurt the program, Mike. If these accusations are true, it could be the end of everything you've worked for." The conversation ended with a promise to stay in touch, but Mike felt the weight of the news settle heavily in his chest. What had he missed? How could something like this be happening without him knowing? In the days that followed, Mike's mind was consumed by the accusations. Every conversation he had seemed to revolve around the looming crisis. He started asking questions, speaking to his financial officer, the outreach workers, even the veterans who had benefited from the program. Each conversation only deepened his concerns. There were whispers of funds being misallocated, administrative errors that had left some veterans without the support they needed, and discrepancies in paperwork. Mike had prided himself on his transparency and honesty, but as the evidence mounted, he began to feel like he was living in a nightmare. He had always believed in doing things right, and now it seemed like everything he had worked for was hanging by a thread. Clara was the first person he turned to for support. She had been his rock throughout all of this, but even she could see the strain on him. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mike," Clara said, sitting across from him at the outreach center. "You can't let rumors and anonymous sources make you doubt everything you've built. But you need to look at the facts. If there's any truth to this, we fix it. We don't run away from it." Mike nodded, though he wasn't sure he could take the weight of another failure. "I just don't get it," he muttered. "Everything seemed so perfect. We were helping people, giving veterans what they needed. How did this happen?" Clara's voice softened. "Sometimes, things look perfect on the outside, but there are cracks underneath. You need to figure out what those cracks are and seal them before they become bigger problems." Mike's phone buzzed, and he looked down to see an email from one of his most trusted partners, a local businessman who had been instrumental in securing several donations for the program. The subject line was simple: "Urgent, we need to talk." Mike's stomach churned as he opened the email. The message inside wasn't much better than what Danvers had hinted at. The businessman was informing him that they'd uncovered some financial discrepancies that had raised concerns. He wanted to meet with Mike as soon as possible to discuss next steps. Mike didn't waste any time. He grabbed his coat and headed for the meeting, his thoughts racing. How had things gotten so complicated? When Mike arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by the businessman, who was already sitting at a table with a few others from the community. The atmosphere in the room was tense. "Mike," the businessman said, his voice calm but firm. "We've reviewed the records. There are discrepancies in how funds are being allocated, and it looks like some donations haven't been accounted for properly. We need to know if this is something you were aware of." Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He had trusted his team to keep everything above board, but now, it seemed like there were layers of deception that had been hidden from him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I didn't know," Mike said, trying to stay composed. "I'm as shocked as you are. I've been focused on the veterans, not the paperwork." The businessman looked at him for a long moment. "Mike, I believe in what you're doing. But if these accusations are true, it's going to be hard to justify continuing this program. People won't trust it anymore. The public, the donors, they'll all pull back." Mike knew the stakes. If he couldn't resolve this issue quickly, everything he had worked for could fall apart. "I'll fix it," Mike said, his voice firm now. "I'll find out where the mismanagement occurred, and I'll make sure we make things right. We'll be transparent, and we'll prove that this program is worth saving." The businessman nodded. "I hope so, Mike. But time is of the essence. You need to act fast." As the days wore on, Mike threw himself into investigating the accusations. He reviewed every financial statement, met with his accounting team, and personally interviewed those who had worked directly with the funds. What he uncovered was startling. It wasn't a matter of theft or fraud, it was a breakdown in communication, a series of human errors, and, unfortunately, some administrative mistakes that had led to the mismanagement. Mike wasn't angry at his team, though part of him wanted to be. Instead, he focused on fixing the problem. He immediately implemented new financial controls, hired an external auditor to conduct a full review, and publicly acknowledged the mistakes in a press release. He didn't try to cover up the errors, instead, he owned them. "We made mistakes," Mike said in the press release. "But we're committed to fixing them. Our veterans deserve the best, and we will ensure that the resources they've been given are used appropriately." The response was mixed. Some people praised his transparency and commitment to accountability, while others saw the mistakes as unforgivable. But Mike wasn't focused on the negative reactions anymore. He had faced his own doubts, the rumors, and the missteps, and now he was doing the hardest thing he had ever done, he was asking for forgiveness. It wasn't easy, but over time, the community began to rally behind Mike again. The support of the veterans and the people who believed in him kept him going. And with each new step toward redemption, he learned that sometimes, being a hero wasn't about always getting everything right, it was about owning up to your mistakes, making things right and continuing the fight, no matter what. The weight of the program's recent turmoil was still fresh in Mike's mind, but the path forward was clearer now. The community had rallied, the financial discrepancies had been addressed, and the veterans who had benefited from the program stood by him. Still, there was something nagging at Mike, a feeling of impending change, of something bigger waiting around the corner. He had come to trust in his instincts over the years, and right now, they were screaming at him that things weren't as settled as they seemed. The program was moving forward, yes, but the aftermath of the financial scandal had left cracks in the foundation that weren't fully healed. The road ahead would be a constant battle for trust, for credibility, and for the future of the initiative. One chilly afternoon, just as Mike was returning to his office after a meeting with some local sponsors, he received a call that would change everything. It was Clara. "Mike, you need to come to the outreach center, now," Clara said urgently, her voice tight with worry. "Something's happened." Mike's stomach tightened as he hung up and hurried to the center. When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him at the front door, her face pale and grave. "Clara, what's going on?" Mike asked, trying to stay calm. "It's worse than I thought," she replied. "There's been a break-in." Mike's heart dropped. "A break-in? Are you serious? What did they take?" Clara nodded, her eyes filled with concern. Not just anything. They went straight for the financial records, the donor lists, everything that could jeopardize the program's integrity. They're trying to bury us, Mike. Mike felt his blood run cold. The implications were too serious to ignore. The Veterans Program had made waves, and if this break-in had been orchestrated by someone with an interest in taking the program down, it could be the final blow. "We need to call the police," Mike said, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. "I already did," Clara replied, "but it's not just about the break-in. We need to figure out who's behind this. This is more than just a random act of theft. Someone is targeting us." Mike felt a sense of betrayal wash over him. How could this be happening now, just when things had started to settle? He had fought so hard to build something meaningful, and now, it felt like it was all crumbling again. Over the next few hours, the police scoured the center, collecting fingerprints and analyzing the scene for clues. Mike and Clara tried to piece together any information that might help explain what had happened. As the investigation unfolded, they began to notice something disturbing: the break-in wasn't random. The intruder had known exactly where to look, where to find the most sensitive information, and they had been methodical in their approach. It wasn't just a case of theft, it felt like an attack. Someone, or perhaps several people, had been watching the program closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that the timing wasn't coincidental. The program was gaining steam, gaining public support, and now someone was trying to stop it in its tracks. Clara was equally shaken. "Who would want to destroy this?" she asked, pacing back and forth. "This is about veterans. We're doing good here. What kind of person would want to tear it down?" Mike didn't have an answer. The only thing that seemed clear was that the people behind the break-in knew the program's vulnerabilities, knew how to exploit them. But who were they? "Do you think it's political?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice quiet. "Do you think it's someone in the government who's trying to get rid of you?" Mike's mind raced. The new administration had been hostile from the start, especially with the political pressures that had come down on the program. Could someone in local government have orchestrated this? Or was it a disgruntled donor? There were so many possibilities, but no clear answers. "What about the veterans?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with worry. "Do you think one of them is involved?" Clara stopped pacing, her face hardening. "It's possible. But we can't jump to conclusions. We need to figure out who's behind this." That night, Mike couldn't sleep. The weight of everything pressing on him was too much to bear. The program had been his life's work, his redemption after everything he had gone through. He couldn't let it be destroyed by faceless enemies. He had already fought back once, but this time felt different. This time, the stakes were higher, and the shadows were closing in faster than he could outrun them. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every conversation he had had, every moment that led him here. It wasn't just the financial issues, the break-in, or the political pressures, it was the bigger question that gnawed at him: why was this happening? Who was so invested in seeing the program fail? His mind eventually turned back to the judge, the one person who had always been a source of guidance for him throughout this process. Mike had known Danvers for years, and the judge had always been upfront with him, even when the truth was hard to hear. Mike picked up the phone and dialed Danvers' number. The phone rang a few times before the judge answered. "Mike, it's late. What's going on?" "I need your help," Mike said urgently. "We've had a break-in at the outreach center. They took everything, financial records, donor lists, everything. And I think it's someone trying to take down the program. Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Danvers spoke again, his tone was different, calm, yet somehow unsettling. "Mike, I've been hearing things," the judge said, his voice low. "People with influence, they're not happy with the direction your program is going. I've heard rumors, whispers in the hallways of power. It's not just a random attack. Someone is orchestrating this. And it's bigger than you think. Mike's heart skipped a beat. The judge had always been a source of wisdom, but now it seemed like he knew more than he was letting on. Who? Mike asked, his voice tight with desperation. I can't say too much right now, Danvers replied. But trust me, Mike, keep your eyes open. The people trying to bring you down are more connected than you realize. The conversation with Danvers only deepened the mystery. Who could be powerful enough to orchestrate something like this? And why? Mike didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to back down. The program had come too far, and it had already saved too many lives. Whoever was behind the attack on his initiative had underestimated him. Mike had already fought the odds before. This time, he wasn't just fighting for veterans, he was fighting for his life's work. And he was ready for whatever came next. Mike's resolve was stronger than ever, but his mind was a whirlwind of questions. The conversation with Judge Danvers had opened a floodgate of doubts and suspicions. Someone with power, influence, and a clear interest in taking down his program was behind the recent attacks. But who? And why? The hours passed in a blur as Mike tried to piece everything together. He revisited his meetings, the donors, and the partners involved in the program. The investigation into the break-in was still ongoing, and though the police had yet to make any arrests or uncover any concrete leads, Mike had a growing sense that they were only scratching the surface. Clara had been an anchor through all of this. She had seen the program through its highs and lows, and now, more than ever, she seemed determined to keep the fight going. Mike, we've got to keep pushing forward, Clara said late one night when they were both sitting in the office, sifting through stacks of paperwork. We can't let this defeat us. We know the program is doing good. We just have to keep the pressure on. Mike nodded, though the weariness in his eyes was evident. I know, Clara. But this feels different. Someone's out there actively trying to destroy what we've built. And they're playing a long game. Clara looked at him, her expression firm. Well, so are we. This isn't just about stopping them. It's about exposing who's behind this. We need to go on the offensive. Mike's thoughts raced, but it was clear she was right. The key wasn't just to defend the program, it was to uncover the shadowy forces pulling the strings. And to do that, they had to dig deeper. The next few days were a blur of late-night meetings and frantic phone calls. Mike and Clara organized a task force within the outreach center to comb through every inch of their records. They dug into the donor lists, scoured emails, and revisited every financial transaction. They interviewed staff, volunteers, and veterans who had come through the program to make sure nothing had slipped through the cracks. But it was during one of these interviews that the first real clues surfaced. Jack, a former Marine who had been receiving support through the program, had shown up at the center to offer his help. He had been one of the first veterans to sign up for Mike's initiative and had since become a trusted member of the community. Mike had always known him as a hard-working, straightforward guy. But there was something different in his eyes now, something Mike couldn't place. Jack, you okay? Mike asked, noticing the tense expression on his face. Jack hesitated, looking over his shoulder before speaking quietly. Mike, I think you need to know something. I wasn't sure whether I should say anything, but I think you need to hear it. Mike's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Jack glanced around again, as if making sure no one else could hear. There's someone on the inside. Someone who's been talking to people on the outside. They know everything about the program, down to the smallest detail. They knew about the break-in before it happened. They knew about the financial troubles. And they're making sure it all gets out to the wrong people. Mike froze, his mind racing. Who is it, Jack? Jack shook his head. I don't know for sure. But I think you need to look closer at some of the people in your inner circle. Someone you trust might be feeding information to them. The words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. The thought that someone inside the program could be working against him was almost too much to bear. But Jack was right, they needed to dig deeper, not just into the people outside the program but into the very people who had been working alongside him all along. The next few days were filled with quiet scrutiny. Mike and Clara worked in the shadows, keeping their suspicions close and moving cautiously. They began reviewing the records of the staff members who had been in charge of overseeing the most sensitive operations, the financial officers, the communications team, and the high-level volunteers who had access to confidential information. One name kept appearing on the list, Angela Harris, a senior financial officer who had been with the program since its inception. She was sharp, dedicated, and incredibly detail-oriented. But in recent weeks, Mike had noticed that she had been growing more distant, more defensive when it came to answering questions about the financial discrepancies. It wasn't like her. "Clara, we need to have a talk with Angela," Mike said one evening, his voice low. "I don't know if we're just being paranoid, but I have a bad feeling." Clara nodded in agreement. "I've been noticing it too. We can't ignore the signs anymore." The confrontation wasn't as explosive as Mike had expected, but it was just as revealing. Angela had been evasive when Mike confronted her about the discrepancies, offering only half-hearted explanations. She had grown increasingly defensive, but when pressed about the missing files, her eyes betrayed something darker, guilt. "You don't understand, Mike," Angela said, her voice shaky. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I just thought I could help. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mike's stomach sank as the words hung in the air. "Help? Help with what?" Angela's face paled, and she seemed to deflate before his eyes. "I was just trying to protect the program. I was trying to make sure it survived. I had no choice. There were people involved, powerful people. They said if I didn't do what they asked, they'd ruin everything. The money was just a small part of it. They wanted to control the program, control the veterans." Mike was stunned. His instincts had been right. Angela wasn't just a bystander in this, she was a pawn, caught in the web of something much bigger. "Who were they?" Clara asked, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "I don't know their names," Angela said, her voice barely a whisper. "But they've been pulling strings from the start. They knew about the break-in. They knew about everything before it even happened. They were going to use you, Mike. Use the program for their own agenda." Mike's mind raced as he processed the revelation. There were people, powerful, dangerous people, who had been manipulating the program from the inside. They had used Angela as a tool, exploiting her fear to sabotage everything Mike had worked for. "How do we stop them?" Mike asked, his voice hard with determination. Angela looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "You have to expose them. You have to go public with what's happening. If you keep hiding, they'll come after you again. And they won't stop until everything you've built is destroyed." The weight of Angela's confession lingered heavily in the air. Mike felt as if he were standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. The people behind this weren't just trying to steal money or destroy a program, they were playing a game that could change everything. But Mike wasn't about to let them win. The time for secrets was over. The truth had finally come to light, but it was more complex, and dangerous, than Mike could have ever anticipated. Angela's confession had shattered the fragile wall of trust Mike had built over the years, and the weight of it was sinking in. The program wasn't just under attack from the outside, it had been compromised from the inside. Mike leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of the web that had been spun around him. Angela, a trusted member of the team, had been coerced into helping the shadowy figures who had their sights set on destroying everything he had worked so hard for. She was a pawn in a much larger game, and Mike had no idea how deep it ran. Clara was still reeling from the revelation. She paced back and forth in the office, her mind working through the details of the conversation. "We need to find out who these people are. If Angela's right, and they've been controlling the program from the inside, then we're dealing with something bigger than just a few bad actors. Mike nodded, his mind racing. Exactly. Whoever they are, they've been manipulating everything. And now, they're going to do everything they can to bury us. We can't afford to sit back and wait for them to strike again. Clara stopped pacing and faced him. But we don't have any hard evidence, Mike. Angela gave us some details, but without something concrete, we're vulnerable. We need to figure out who's really behind this. Mike's frustration boiled over. I know. But right now, we're playing catch-up. The police are investigating the break-in, but they don't have the resources or the connections to get to the bottom of this. It's up to us to find the people pulling the strings. For a moment, the two of them were silent. The situation was dire, but there was a glimmer of hope. The truth had been exposed, and they could now act. They weren't in the dark anymore, and the game was changing. Let's go public, Mike said, breaking the silence. It's time. If we expose the corruption, it'll force their hand. The public won't stand for it. Clara frowned. But what if they retaliate? We don't know who's behind this, Mike. We could be walking into a trap. Mike's jaw clenched. I'm not going to let them destroy everything we've built. We have to take the fight to them. I'd rather expose them now than let them continue to operate in the shadows. The decision was made. Mike and Clara began drafting a statement, preparing to release it to the press. The revelation of internal sabotage, though shocking, would shed light on the true scale of the conspiracy and put pressure on those behind it. They began to work with their most trusted allies, veterans who had once been beneficiaries of the program but had become advocates, volunteers who understood the importance of the mission, and even some of the program's corporate sponsors. The community that had rallied behind the initiative would now be its greatest weapon. The statement was clear, concise, and damning. It acknowledged the challenges the program had faced, financial troubles, the break-in, and internal sabotage, but it made one thing abundantly clear: they would not be intimidated, and they would not back down. We are not just fighting for the future of this program, Mike wrote in the statement. We are fighting for the future of every veteran who has been served, every life that has been changed, and every community that has benefited from this initiative. We will expose those who have conspired to undermine our work, and we will not rest until they are held accountable. With the statement prepared, Mike and Clara sent it out to the media, eager to see how the public would react. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, news outlets across the country picked up the story, and Mike's name was once again in the headlines. But this time, it was different. The media was not just focused on the financial troubles of the program or the break-in, they were now investigating a possible conspiracy involving high-level players with a vested interest in bringing the program down. But Mike knew this was just the beginning. The media attention would be helpful, but it wasn't enough to stop the shadowy figures who had been working behind the scenes. They would come after him harder now that he had exposed them, and he had to be ready for whatever was next. The following days were filled with more revelations, more interviews, and more public attention. As the media investigated, they began uncovering evidence of connections between powerful local figures and corporate interests who stood to gain from the program's destruction. Donations had been funneled from sources with questionable motives, and several high-profile business leaders had been tied to shady dealings that included money laundering and underhanded tactics to control veterans' initiatives like Mike's. But even as the public was beginning to rally behind Mike, there was a darker, more insidious force at play. The people behind the sabotage were far from finished. Mike received a cryptic phone call one evening that sent a chill down his spine. The voice on the other end was distorted, as though coming through a filter, but Mike could hear the malice in every word. You think exposing us will stop us? You have no idea what you're up against. This is just the beginning. You've made a big mistake, Mike. The line went dead before Mike could respond. He had suspected they would strike back, but hearing it in such a direct, threatening manner confirmed it. They weren't just playing for money or influence. They were playing for something far more dangerous: control. And they wouldn't stop until they had it. The message was clear. If Mike wanted to save the program, he would have to fight for it with everything he had. The gloves were off, and the stakes had never been higher. As Mike sat back, processing the phone call, Clara entered the room, her face set with determination. "We can't let them win," she said, her voice unwavering. Mike looked up at her. "We won't. We're not backing down now." It was clear now, the battle wasn't just for the program, it was for the very future of veterans who depended on it. And Mike was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed the threatening phone call were a blur of strategy and tension. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The shadowy figures behind the conspiracy had only just begun to show their cards, and they were playing for keeps. Clara was just as determined as ever. The public response had been overwhelming in their favor, but they both knew that the media attention was only a double-edged sword. While it brought the conspiracy into the light, it also made them a bigger target. The game had changed, and Mike could feel the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on him. They needed allies, and fast. Allies who could not only provide support but also offer protection and intelligence in ways the police couldn't. Mike knew that finding the right people would be crucial. If they were going to win this, they needed to fight fire with fire. "We need to go straight to the source," Mike said one night as he sat across from Clara in the now familiar war room that had once been an office but had now turned into their strategy hub. "I have an idea, but it's risky." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I've been hearing things about a former military contractor who might know something about the people behind this. His name's Jack Donovan. He's a former Special Forces operator, now retired. A lot of people have whispered that he's got connections to people who deal with this kind of underhanded stuff." Clara was silent for a moment, considering. "And you think he'll help us?" "I don't know. But if we can get to him, we might be able to break through some of these walls. This isn't just about money, it's about power. And Donovan has his finger on the pulse of some very dangerous people." Clara took a deep breath. "All right, we have no choice. We'll reach out to him." Mike had never been one to take shortcuts when it came to his program, but desperation had a way of making even the most cautious of people take risks. Finding Jack Donovan wasn't easy, and it took a few days of digging, phone calls, and quiet inquiries through the right channels. But eventually, they got a lead. Donovan was known to frequent a particular bar on the outskirts of town, a quiet, dimly lit place where veterans and ex-contractors tended to gather to exchange stories, and perhaps, less than legal business. It felt like a world away from the outreach center Mike had built, but he knew this was the only way forward. When they arrived at the bar, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of whiskey and stale cigarettes. The low hum of conversation filled the air, and the lights were dim enough to give the place a sense of secrecy. Mike and Clara made their way to the back, where a few men sat around a table, their voices low and gruff. At the far end of the room sat a man with a hardened face and piercing blue eyes, Jack Donovan. He looked up as they approached, his gaze calculating. For a moment, neither side spoke, sizing each other up. Donovan's presence was commanding, but Mike didn't hesitate. He'd come this far, and now he needed answers. "Mr. Donovan," Mike began, his voice steady but laced with a sense of urgency. "We need your help." Donovan studied him for a moment, then took a slow drag from his cigarette before flicking it into the ashtray. "I don't do charity work. What makes you think I'll help you?" Clara stepped forward. "We're not here for handouts. We're fighting something bigger than we can handle on our own. We know that you have connections to people who might know about the ones behind this conspiracy. The ones trying to bring down the program for their own gain." Donovan raised an eyebrow. "So you're in over your head, and now you want me to clean up your mess?" Mike didn't flinch. "Not just clean it up. Help us expose the ones behind it. Help us fight back." For a long moment, Donovan said nothing. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very room held its breath. Finally, he spoke. "I don't get involved in things that don't make me money," he said. "But I've seen programs like yours before. I've seen good men and women try to do the right thing, only to get destroyed by the people who pull the strings behind the scenes. You want to win this fight? You need to stop thinking like a charity and start thinking like a war." Mike's heart raced. This wasn't the answer he had been hoping for, but it was the answer he needed. Donovan wasn't just going to hand them information on a silver platter. He needed to be convinced that they were capable of taking on the fight and winning. "We're ready to fight," Mike said, his voice firm. "We don't have much time. The longer we wait, the more damage they do." Donovan leaned back in his chair, considering the words. Finally, he sighed and motioned for them to sit. "All right, I'll help you. But don't think it's going to be easy. This goes deeper than you realize. And I'm not just talking about shady businessmen or corrupt politicians. The people behind this? They've got connections to some very dangerous groups. Military contractors, mercenaries, you name it. This won't just be a battle, it'll be a war. Are you prepared for that?" Mike exchanged a glance with Clara. There was no turning back now. "We're prepared," Mike said, his voice unwavering. Donovan took out a small notebook and scribbled something down before sliding it across the table to Mike. "These are the names you'll need. They're not all directly involved, but they've got ties to the people pulling the strings. You'll need to move quickly. And when you do, don't trust anyone who's ever worked with them." Mike nodded, pocketing the note. This was the break they needed. But it was just the beginning. As they left the bar, Clara looked over at Mike. "Do you think we can trust him?" Mike exhaled slowly, his mind still processing everything Donovan had said. "I don't know. But right now, we don't have a choice. He's our best shot at getting answers. And getting ahead of them before they make their next move." Clara nodded, her expression set. "Then we need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But with Donovan's help, Mike now had a new path forward, a dangerous one, but one that could lead to victory. The quiet hum of the city outside Mike's office window felt almost foreign now, as though the calm was mocking the storm brewing on the horizon. The day after meeting with Jack Donovan, Mike and Clara had set in motion a new phase of their battle. With Donovan's information in hand, they were about to confront the shadowy forces that had been orchestrating the destruction of their program. Mike couldn't afford to make a mistake. The names Donovan had given them were crucial, each one was a link in a chain that led to the heart of the conspiracy. Some were small-time players, others had significant influence in both corporate and military circles. But they all had one thing in common. They were deeply connected to the people who had been undermining his work. "You ready?" Clara's voice snapped Mike out of his thoughts. She was standing beside him, holding a stack of files filled with details on the individuals Donovan had mentioned. Mike took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." The files Donovan had given them weren't just lists of names, they were a roadmap. He had written down the names of mercenaries, shady businessmen, and corrupt officials. They all had their fingers in the same pot, all tied to a conspiracy designed to dismantle the program Mike had fought so hard to build. Donovan had given them the first names to target, but there was a catch. To take down the ones at the top, they would need to take down everyone in between. Clara leaned over the desk, glancing at the information. "It's all connected. These people have been working together for years, pulling strings behind the scenes. We can't just take them out one by one." Mike nodded grimly. "No. We need to break the entire network. If we just focus on one person, the others will close ranks, and we'll be right back where we started. We need to hit them where it hurts." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and intense strategy sessions. They gathered intelligence, speaking to trusted insiders, and digging deeper into the lives of the individuals on Donovan's list. But the more they uncovered, the darker the situation became. These weren't just corrupt officials or businessmen, some of them had ties to global criminal organizations. Others were connected to private military contractors who specialized in covert operations, people who could make someone disappear without a trace. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. The web of lies and deceit stretched far beyond what Mike had ever imagined. It was a full-scale operation, one that had been years in the making. By the end of the week, Mike and Clara had made a decision. They needed to go on the offensive, but carefully. They couldn't just burst into the lion's den without a plan. They would start with someone smaller, someone who had less protection, but whose involvement in the conspiracy was significant enough to make waves. It was a calculated risk. But it was the only way they could start to dismantle the operation without drawing too much attention to themselves too quickly. That night, they sat in the war room, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. "Let's go after Harris," Mike said, his finger tapping the name on the file in front of him. "He's the least connected of the ones we've found so far, and he's been skimming money off the top of the program's funds. He's not clean, he's the perfect first target." Clara nodded in agreement. "We have a small window of opportunity. Harris has a meeting with a major investor tomorrow. If we can get to him before he talks, we might be able to shake things up without him going to ground." Mike's eyes narrowed as he considered the risk. "We'll have to move fast. We can't afford to let him warn the others." They spent the rest of the night finalizing the plan. The attack on Harris would need to be swift, precise, and without warning. The team was small, but they were prepared. They had no intention of going in blind. They had people on the inside watching, tracking Harris's every move. They knew his schedule, his routine, and his vulnerabilities. It was time to play the game. The next day, the tension was palpable as Mike and Clara watched the clock tick down. They were positioned in a van, parked just down the street from Harris's office building. A few of their trusted allies were stationed nearby, ready to move the moment they made their move. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation, it was going to be an interrogation. As Harris exited the building, walking toward his car, Mike felt his heart rate pick up. The moment had arrived. Clara keyed the radio. "All teams in position." "Ready," came the reply. Mike's voice was steady, though the adrenaline coursing through his veins was undeniable. "It's showtime." They moved quickly. Clara and Mike were the first to approach Harris, who was fumbling with his keys, oblivious to the danger closing in around him. Mike grabbed his arm and spun him around, slamming him against the side of the car. "Mike! What the hell is this?" Harris yelped, his eyes wide with panic. "You've been a very bad boy, Harris," Mike said, his voice low and dangerous. "We need answers. Now." Harris's face twisted in fear, and for a moment, it seemed like he might crumble. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mike could see the sweat beading on his forehead, his body shaking. "What do you want?" Harris finally croaked. "We know about your involvement in the corruption, Harris," Clara said, stepping forward. "We know you've been siphoning money and playing both sides. You're working with people who want to destroy everything we've built. And we're not leaving until we get the full story." Harris took a deep breath, looking around as though considering his options. He knew the game was up. I don't know everything," Harris stammered. I just do what I'm told. They said I'd be protected if I helped them. They said no one would come after me." Mike leaned in closer. "Who, Harris? Who told you that? Who's pulling the strings?" The pressure was mounting. Harris's eyes darted around again, but Mike and Clara weren't going to let him go until he cracked. Finally, Harris broke. "I didn't know it would go this far. But it's them, Caldwell and his crew. They're the ones running everything. Mike felt a jolt of recognition. Caldwell. The name had come up before, in a few of their investigations, but now it was clear. Caldwell was the key to everything. They had their lead. The conspiracy's mastermind was Caldwell, a name that Mike would soon learn was as dangerous as it was elusive. As Harris was handed over to their allies for questioning, Mike and Clara exchanged looks. The game had just become more dangerous, but now, they had the target. And they weren't going to stop until they took him down. The name Caldwell echoed in Mike's mind, growing louder with every passing second. This was the man who had been behind the scenes of it all, the one pulling the strings, orchestrating the corruption and destruction of everything Mike had worked for. If they were going to have any chance of stopping this, they had to get to him. And fast. But Caldwell wasn't someone you could just walk up to and confront. He was a ghost, slippery, elusive, and surrounded by layers of protection. The name alone didn't reveal much, but Mike knew that it was a break in the case they couldn't afford to ignore. Clara paced the room, flipping through the files of intel they'd gathered. Caldwell's got to be using proxies. He's too high up to be exposed easily. We're going to need to find out who he trusts, who's been working with him directly. Mike sat at the table, his mind running through their options. They had to hit him where it hurt, and that meant finding the people closest to him. The ones who knew his secrets, his weaknesses, and his strategy. I'm thinking we go after his financial ties first, Mike said, finally speaking up. If we can cut off his money supply, we can shake him loose. He'll be forced into the open. Clara stopped pacing and looked at him. You think he's just going to let his guard down? You're talking about going after everything he's built. He won't go down without a fight. Mike met her gaze, his expression hard. I don't expect him to go down easily. But right now, we don't have the luxury of time. We go after the money, and we force him to reveal himself. Once we have him cornered, he won't have a choice but to talk. They both knew there was no turning back now. The battle was on, and there was no more room for hesitation. Over the next few days, Mike and Clara worked relentlessly, diving into the financial world Caldwell inhabited. They tracked down bank accounts, shell companies, and investments that Caldwell had hidden behind layers of aliases. His empire was vast, stretching across various industries, and everything was designed to keep him hidden in the shadows. But no matter how deep the rabbit hole went, they were determined to follow it. We found something, Clara said one evening, her voice crackling with the intensity of the breakthrough. There's a fund, hidden in plain sight. It's connected to some of the same companies Caldwell has been working with. It's where all his money is funneled. Mike stood up, his pulse quickening. How do we get to it? Clara pushed a few buttons on her laptop, bringing up a series of transactions on the screen. It's a complicated network of investments, but there's one name that keeps coming up, a financial advisor named Patrick Monroe. He's been managing Caldwell's accounts for years, and he's tied to all these shell companies. Mike's mind raced. Monroe could be the key. He was the one holding the purse strings to Caldwell's empire. If they could get to him, they could potentially unravel Caldwell's financial infrastructure, and, hopefully, get closer to the man himself. We need to find him, Mike said, his voice steady. We need to know everything about Monroe. Where he is, who he talks to, who he trusts. If we can take him down, Caldwell will have no way of hiding. Clara nodded. We'll have to move fast. Monroe's not going to be an easy target. The next morning, Mike and Clara were already on the move. They had narrowed down Monroe's location to a high-end apartment in the city, a luxury building with tight security. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. They needed to be strategic. The last thing they wanted was for Monroe to disappear before they could get the information they needed. Clara had called in a few favors, and within hours, they had the building's layout, Monroe's schedule, and a handful of surveillance photos. The plan was to intercept him when he left the building for a meeting later that afternoon. Let's make sure we have everything in place, Mike said, as they reviewed the final details. We can't afford to mess this up. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, Mike and Clara positioned themselves outside the building, their nerves taut with anticipation. The tension in the air was palpable. They were about to make their move. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Monroe emerged from the building, dressed in a sharp suit, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking to someone, clearly negotiating a deal. Mike and Clara watched from across the street, eyes locked on their target. This was it. "We follow him," Mike whispered, his voice low. "Keep it tight." They kept their distance as Monroe walked to a black SUV parked nearby, slipping inside and driving off toward an unknown destination. Mike and Clara followed, their car blending into the traffic. They knew the stakes were high. Monroe was the link they needed to Caldwell, and they couldn't afford to lose him. An hour later, the SUV pulled into a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. It was a low-profile location. No signs, no indications that it was anything other than a regular business. But Mike knew better. This was a meeting place for people who didn't want to be found. "Park here," Clara instructed, as they found a spot across the street. "We wait." Time seemed to slow as they sat in the car, watching the office building's entrance. They couldn't afford to make a move too early. If they spooked Monroe, he might vanish, taking all the answers with him. They had to be patient. After what felt like an eternity, Monroe exited the building. This time, he wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit walked beside him, whispering something in his ear. Mike's heart raced as he recognized the man. It was Caldwell's right-hand man, a figure who had been mentioned in Donovan's files, but whose face had never been seen. This was it. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. As Monroe and his associate drove away, Mike and Clara exchanged a look. They had just gotten their first real sighting of Caldwell's inner circle. "We have to follow them," Mike said, determination in his voice. Clara nodded. "Let's go." They followed the SUV for several miles, careful not to get too close. Finally, it stopped at a secluded mansion on the outskirts of town, an area surrounded by tall gates and surveillance cameras. It was clear that this wasn't just any meeting spot. This was a place where high-level business, and dangerous decisions, were made. Mike's pulse quickened. They had found Caldwell's stronghold. "We've got them," Mike said quietly, his eyes scanning the mansion through binoculars. "Now we just need to figure out how to get in." But they both knew that breaking into this place wasn't going to be easy. It was a fortress. Still, they had come too far to back down now. Caldwell was within reach, and Mike wasn't going to stop until he had answers. The mansion loomed like a fortress against the darkening sky, a symbol of everything Mike had come to despise over the past few weeks. It was a fortress in more ways than one. The high gates and impenetrable surveillance system ensured that whoever lived there was shielded from the world. But Mike wasn't afraid of obstacles. He had faced worse, he had survived in the trenches of battlefields and business alike. Now, all that stood between him and Caldwell was a thick wall of security, and Mike was prepared to tear it down. As they watched the mansion from their position across the street, Clara adjusted her earpiece and checked the time. It was just after midnight, the perfect time to strike. The guards would be a little less vigilant, the routine a little more predictable. But Mike knew they had to move fast. Caldwell had to be there. He couldn't let this opportunity slip by. "Okay," Mike said, his voice sharp, "we need to move in quickly. We get in, we gather what we can, and we get out. If we're lucky, we'll find Caldwell in there. If we're not, we'll have enough to make him come to us." Clara nodded, her face set in determination. She had become just as obsessed with bringing down Caldwell as Mike had. They had both crossed a point of no return. This wasn't just about the program anymore, it was about justice, about exposing the dark, hidden world that Caldwell had built in the shadows. The car was parked at the edge of the street, partially concealed behind some trees. They got out quietly, leaving nothing behind to alert the guards to their presence. The plan was simple: break into the mansion, find Monroe or someone who knew where Caldwell was, and gather the information they needed to take him down. "Ready?" Mike asked. "Always," Clara replied, her voice steady. They moved as one, slipping into the darkness like ghosts, their footsteps light but purposeful. Clara had taken the lead on surveillance and security, and Mike trusted her instincts. They approached the mansion's perimeter, where the high wall of the estate was guarded by an electrified fence and security cameras perched high above. They had studied the layout of the mansion for hours. They knew the weak spots. The back gate was less heavily monitored than the front, and there was a small maintenance entrance that led directly into the mansion's lower levels. The plan was to sneak through, avoid the cameras, and head straight to the main building. Clara crouched low, motioning for Mike to follow. They were in the shadow of the outer wall now, almost invisible to anyone watching. Clara worked quickly, pulling a small device from her bag and hacking into the security system. A soft beep signaled success, and the gate creaked open just enough for them to slip through. Once inside, they were in. But that didn't mean the danger was over. Mike could feel the tension in the air, the knowledge that any sound or wrong move could alert the guards. They moved quickly but cautiously through the manicured garden, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The mansion itself was grand, more like a palace than a home. It was all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and art that probably cost more than Mike's entire salary. The kind of place where men like Caldwell hid behind wealth, convinced they were untouchable. "We need to head for the basement," Clara whispered, her voice low and urgent. "That's where the real business happens. If Caldwell's here, that's where he'll be." Mike nodded, his heart beating in his chest like a drum. This was it. They were close. He could feel it. They moved swiftly, finding an unguarded door that led to the mansion's lower levels. As they descended the staircase, Mike's senses were heightened, the silence pressing in around him. Every step felt like it could be their last, every corner could hide a guard or a camera. When they reached the basement level, they found themselves in a large, open area. This was where the real operations took place: desks lined with computers, shelves of files and documents, and an array of secured cabinets. It was everything they needed to destroy Caldwell's empire. "Start looking through the files," Mike ordered, his voice a whisper. "I'll check the computers." Clara didn't hesitate. She went to the first filing cabinet, pulling it open with quiet efficiency. Mike moved toward the computer terminals, his eyes scanning the monitors for anything that could give him an edge. Time was of the essence. They couldn't afford to be caught here. As he sat down, he saw that one of the computers had been left unlocked. He wasted no time and began to sift through the files, pulling up a variety of documents related to financial transactions, private meetings, and reports detailing the operations of Caldwell's organization. Everything Mike needed to expose Caldwell's secrets was right in front of him. Suddenly, a door at the far end of the room opened. Mike's heart stopped. He stood, eyes darting to Clara, who was still rifling through papers. She hadn't noticed yet. The footsteps grew louder, and Mike could see a figure approaching. He motioned to Clara, his body tense. Without a word, Clara slid behind a large filing cabinet, disappearing into the shadows. Mike did the same, ducking behind a desk and holding his breath. The man who entered the room wasn't Caldwell. It was one of his men, a heavy-set guy with a rough face. He walked into the center of the room, muttering something under his breath, clearly not expecting anyone to be there. Mike's mind raced. He had to act fast. He couldn't let this man raise an alarm. Slowly, Mike reached for his gun, his fingers brushing the cool metal as he prepared for the worst. But just as he was about to make a move, something unexpected happened. The man stopped in his tracks, his gaze shifting toward the back of the room. Someone else was there. Caldwell, the man said, his voice a mixture of surprise and dread. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure how Caldwell had managed to sneak in, but there he was. The elusive mastermind himself. Standing in front of Mike, Clara, and the evidence they needed to bring him down. But Caldwell wasn't the only one in the room. There were two other men with him, their eyes scanning the room for intruders. "Time's up, Mike," Caldwell's cold voice rang out. "You've been digging too deep. Now, it's time to end this." The air in the room was thick with tension. Mike's pulse raced as he stood there, trapped between Caldwell and his two armed men. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to fight back, but he knew that rushing in without a plan would only guarantee failure. Caldwell's icy gaze met his, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. It was as if the world had frozen in place. "Caldwell," Mike said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "you think you've won, don't you? But you've underestimated me. You've underestimated what I'm capable of." Caldwell's lips curled into a smug smile. "Oh, Mike. I knew you'd come for me eventually. You've always had that fire, but you're too late. Everything's already in motion. You can't stop what's coming." Mike's mind raced. He wasn't going to let Caldwell's arrogance intimidate him. He'd come too far to be stopped now. The files on the computer and the evidence Clara had uncovered, this was their chance to finally bring him down. All he needed was a moment. A single slip-up. Clara was still hidden behind the filing cabinet, watching carefully. Mike's eyes flicked toward her, and he knew she was calculating her next move. She was just as determined as he was to make sure Caldwell didn't walk away from this. The odds were stacked against them, but Mike had faced worse. He had survived battles far more dangerous than this. He wasn't about to lose now. Caldwell took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Mike's. "You think you've got me cornered, but you're wrong. You're nothing but a relic. The world is changing, and I've already positioned myself to profit from it. The game's over, Mike." Mike didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to show any fear now. "The game's not over until I say it is. And you're going to wish you'd never crossed me." Caldwell's smile faltered, and for a moment, Mike saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew he had Caldwell on edge. He had to press forward, take advantage of the hesitation. But just as he opened his mouth to speak again, the door to the basement creaked open. A new figure entered the room, a man in a dark suit that Mike didn't recognize. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, and both Caldwell and his men turned to face him. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Caldwell's expression turned cold. "Nothing that concerns you," he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. But even though he tried to hide it, Mike could sense a shift. Caldwell was no longer the confident, untouchable figure he had been just moments before. He was rattled. And that was exactly what Mike needed. The man in the suit studied Mike and Clara, his gaze lingering on the files spread out on the desk. "I don't like this," he said quietly, his tone more guarded now. Mike's heart quickened. Was this someone else connected to Caldwell's operation? A potential ally or another enemy? Whatever the case, this was a new variable in the equation, and Mike needed to figure out what role this man played before they could move forward. Clara, ever the strategist, sensed the shift too. Without hesitation, she stood up from behind the filing cabinet, her movements fluid. "We're here for one thing," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "To bring him down." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You think you can take me down just like that? You don't even understand the half of it, Mike. You don't understand who you're dealing with." "I don't need to understand everything about you," Mike said, taking a step forward. "I just need to know enough to destroy you." The man in the suit shifted, and Mike noticed the faint glint of recognition in his eyes. This man knew him. He knew who Mike was. But before Mike could analyze it further, the man raised a hand, signaling for Caldwell to calm down. "We don't have time for this," the man said, his voice suddenly much sharper. "Caldwell, you've made enough mistakes. It's time we all talk." Caldwell glanced at him, but his pride didn't allow him to back down. "What do you mean? You think you can control me too?" The man in the suit didn't flinch. "The pieces are already moving, Caldwell. We've got a bigger problem now. And I'm afraid your little empire might be crumbling faster than you think." That was it. The line that Mike had been waiting for. There was something more at play here, something that even Caldwell wasn't fully in control of. Mike stepped forward again, closer to Caldwell, his resolve solidifying. "You're not invincible, Caldwell. You've made deals with the wrong people, and you've betrayed the wrong trust. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Caldwell sneered. "And how are you going to do that? With your little files? You think that's enough to stop me? I've got a network that spans the globe." Mike's hand shot out, grabbing the stack of documents Clara had pulled from the filing cabinet. He slammed them down on the desk in front of Caldwell, his fingers trembling with the weight of the moment. "These are enough to bury you," Mike said, his voice low and full of venom. "Every dirty deal, every shady investment, every lie you've told. It's all right here. And the world's going to know about it." Caldwell's eyes flicked to the documents, and for the first time, a real flicker of fear crossed his face. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't ready to surrender yet. "I'll destroy all of this," he spat. "I'll bury you both before you even have a chance to expose me." Clara stepped forward, her eyes hard and unforgiving. "You won't have time. You won't have time to hide this, Caldwell. We've already set the wheels in motion. You're finished." The man in the suit looked between them all, and for a moment, it seemed like he was considering his next move carefully. "Enough," he said, holding up a hand. "You want to play this game, Caldwell? Fine. But we need to talk about how this ends." Mike felt the shift in the air again. It was as if everything was hanging in the balance. This wasn't just about Caldwell anymore. It was about something bigger, something none of them had anticipated. As Caldwell's smug expression began to falter, the man in the suit turned to Mike, his eyes narrowing. "There's something you don't know, Mike. Something that changes everything." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever been in a situation where the truth you thought you knew turned out to be a lie? What would you do when the rules of the game change before your very eyes? Let us know your thoughts below.